What if the story we tell ourselves about human civilization has always been missing its first chapter? We are used to the image of a slow climb. Scattered hunters shaping crude stone tools, small tribes gathering by rivers, villages that one day grew into cities, temples, and kings. Yet when we peer closer, the climb does not look smooth. Instead, it looks like sudden leaps, as though pieces of knowledge arrived all at once. Farming already organized, cities already planned, writing already tied to law and astronomy. The monuments stand as witnesses, built with skills we cannot quite trace back to their origin. Were these steps the natural result of human trial and error, or fragments of something older, something carried from a forgotten age, or perhaps even from beyond our world? This is not an answer hidden in textbooks, but a question that lingers across ruins, myths, and stars. If we dare to follow it, we may find that our beginnings are stranger than we imagine, and that the ground beneath us is only one stop in a longer journey of civilization. Welcome to Historic Sleep. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right, and let me know in the comments where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now. I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. When you first step into the mystery of beginnings, it feels like walking across a plain where the ground suddenly gives way to cliffs. The official story says, humanity moved slowly from wandering bands to fields and houses, yet the record of our past looks less like gentle hills and more like sudden drops and dizzying rises. It is here, at the edge of certainty, that imagination begins to stir, not as fantasy, but as the necessary glue to hold together fragments of evidence. We picture small groups moving with the rhythm of seasons, following herds, crafting stone blades, and painting with ochre on cave walls. For tens of thousands of years, this is all we see. Then, like a bolt of lightning cutting across a dark horizon, structures appear that should not belong to the people who supposedly built them. At Göbekli Tepe, in the hills of modern Turkey, there are circles of stone pillars taller than a person, weighing tons, carved with foxes, vultures, snakes, and abstract signs. They date back more than 11,000 years, when, according to the story, people were still nomads without fields or permanent homes. Yet there it stands, not a scattering of huts, but a deliberate, vast ceremonial complex. To imagine it built by wanderers with no hierarchy or organized labor stretches belief. And still, archaeologists dig and confirm. It is real, older than pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than anything we call civilization. The puzzle deepens when we notice that agriculture, too, seems to arrive as a finished gift rather than an invention patiently polished through trial and error. Wheat in the Middle East, rice in Asia, maize in the Americas, potatoes in the Andes. They appear in the archaeological record not as half-domesticated plants, but as crops ready to support large communities. Where are the centuries of failed attempts? The endless fields of weeds that should have preceded success? The traces are faint at best, leaving us with the sense that farmers of the deep past held knowledge that did not emerge entirely from trial and error. It is as if someone, somewhere, handed humanity seeds along with the instructions to use them. This is not to deny the ingenuity of ancient peoples, but to wonder why the leaps seem so sudden, why the bridge between the wild and the cultivated feels so short. As we walk forward in time, the pattern repeats. In Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization, cities like Uruk burst onto the stage around 3100 BCE. Not huts scattered in the dust, but streets laid with intention, ziggurats rising above the plain, and cuneiform tablets filled with accounts of trade, astronomy, and ritual. The writing system does not look like the clumsy sketches of someone just learning to represent words. It looks complete, tied from the beginning to administration and the stars. Egypt, too, seems to bloom overnight. Hieroglyphs arrive already rich in form, irrigation projects appear capable of taming the Nile, and within a few centuries of the first dynasties, the Great Pyramid at Giza stands, aligned with uncanny precision to the cardinal directions. There are no smaller training pyramids that steadily lead to this marvel. Instead, it arrives full-grown, as though the builders remembered something no longer visible in the progression of ruins. The Indus Valley, far to the east, reveals its own surprise. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa show streets set in perfect grids, drainage systems more advanced than those found in later cities, standardized weights, and wide trade networks. Yet the trail of earlier attempts is missing, as though the blueprint arrived fully drawn. In the Americas, the Olmec appear around 1500 BCE with colossal stone heads and ceremonial centers that speak of deep astronomy and ritual complexity. Their successors, the Maya, unfold an intricate calendar system and a script capable of recording dynasties, myths, and mathematics. Once again, no clumsy beginnings, only finished systems waiting to be discovered. This strangeness has fueled not only scholarly debate, but also myth. Across cultures, stories whisper that the knowledge of the ancients was a gift, not an invention. The Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki, beings from the heavens who taught them agriculture, writing, and kingship. Egyptians remembered Osiris, the stranger who brought order, laws, and crops to the Nile. In Mesoamerica, the feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl, descended from across the sea to teach the sciences, then departed with a promise to return. The Dogon of West Africa carried traditions about beings from Sirius, the star system modern telescopes later confirmed as binary, knowledge curiously precise for a people without advanced instruments. Myths, of course, are not straightforward records, but their common rhythm is striking. Knowledge comes from beyond, not from gradual invention. Skeptics rightly point out that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Maybe the failed experiments simply decayed or lie buried, waiting to be unearthed. Perhaps climate change forced innovation at speeds faster than our models predict. Perhaps human memory, long underestimated, held techniques passed orally for millennia until the right moment allowed them to flourish. Yet these explanations still leave the leaps looking abrupt, the gaps too wide, the monuments too bold for their supposed first attempts. What makes the mystery more haunting is the sense of memory that clings to stone. Megaliths stand like bookmarks in the Earth's story, reminders that something was known and expressed, then lost, then remembered in fragments. Stone endures where wood and fabric vanish. What survives may not be the beginning of the story, but the echoes of something earlier. If a civilization once flourished before the ice melted, its coastal cities may now rest under oceans, its perishable works dissolved by time, leaving only scattered survivors like Göbekli Tepe to challenge the narrative of progress. When we string together these puzzles, The sudden crops, the sudden cities, the sudden writing, the sudden monuments, they form not a straight ladder, but a series of cliffs. Each cliff forces us to ask whether civilization is truly born fresh on Earth, or whether we are remembering, inheriting, or rediscovering fragments of something older. This is where speculation enters, not as fantasy, but as a response to silence in the record. Some imagine lost civilizations drowned by floods, their memory carried forward in myth. Others stretch further, asking if life itself was seeded from beyond, carried here by comets or visitors across stars. These ideas may sound extraordinary, but they echo the same feeling, that the roots of our story are deeper than the soil beneath our feet. The tale of sudden beginnings is not just about history, it is about identity. To stand before the Great Pyramid or the carved pillars of Göbekli Tepe is to feel both pride and unease. Pride, because they remind us of human capability, endurance, and imagination. Unease, because they hint at something we cannot fully explain, a missing link in our own origin. Are we the first to rise, or merely the latest inheritors of a memory carried across time, preserved in stone, myth, and stars? As we continue this journey, we walk not only into ruins and theories, but into the shadow of a possibility. That the story of civilization did not truly begin here, but was already in motion long before Earth was ready to record it. To understand why the beginnings of civilization feel more like leaps than steps, it helps to stand still in the silence of ruins and let the questions seep in. Imagine wandering through the stones of Mohenjo-Daro at dawn, the sun catching narrow streets aligned in perfect grids, drains running beneath your feet, brick houses lined in order as if drawn from a plane. Then remember that this city flourished around 2500 BCE, when, by the standard story, people were only beginning to experiment with urban life. No clumsy versions of city planning survive in the record. No crooked grids or half-built drainage systems show us the trial and error. Instead, the city arrives complete, humming with a rhythm of life that feels rehearsed. The same sensation stirs when you step into the shadow of the Great Pyramid at Giza. Each stone weighs tons, stacked with a precision so sharp that even modern builders pause to measure its perfection. Where, one wonders, are the training pyramids, the smaller, clumsy towers that should have come before? They are absent, or at least invisible, leaving us with the impression of a sudden, almost theatrical unveiling of mastery. These absences are not limited to Egypt or the Indus. Across the world, civilizations appear to awaken fully formed. The Olmec carved colossal heads with expressions so detailed that you feel the presence of forgotten rulers staring back. The Maya wrote elaborate glyphs and tracked cycles of Venus with a precision better than the Gregorian calendar still used today. The Sumerians, in the land between the rivers, recorded trade, law, and astronomy with wedge-shaped cuneiform that seems far too polished for its supposed first appearance. We might expect a messy history filled with false starts, but what we see is polished systems arriving like actors stepping onto the stage already in costume. Scholars working within the mainstream framework offer explanations that are rational and grounded. They argue that the traces of early trial and error have simply not survived, washed away by floods or buried beneath later layers of history. They point to climate change at the end of the last ice age, suggesting that new pressures pushed people to innovate faster than usual, forcing leaps rather than gradual steps. Others argue that the human mind itself was more inventive than we give it credit for, capable of remembering and refining knowledge over generations without leaving much behind in material traces. These are sober arguments, but they do not erase the strangeness. They leave us with reasonable explanations, yet the feeling remains that something is missing, that the story of progress is more fragmented than we are told. Into this vacuum of certainty, myths and traditions speak with their own voices. The Sumerians did not describe themselves as inventors of their world. They spoke of the Anunnaki, beings from the heavens who handed them agriculture, kingship, and writing. The Egyptians remembered Osiris, a figure not of this land, but arriving to teach them laws, crops, and rituals. In Central America, the Maya and Aztecs told of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who crossed seas to bring calendars and sciences. The Dogon people of West Africa told stories of ancestors descending from Sirius, knowledge wrapped in myth but strangely aligned with later discoveries that Sirius is a binary star system. These stories differ in detail, but they rhyme in rhythm. Civilization is not created alone. It is given whether by gods, ancestors, or visitors. It is tempting to dismiss these accounts as poetic metaphor, as the natural human tendency to turn abstract forces into divine figures. Yet when stories echo across oceans and continents, separated by millennia, they carry a weight that resists simple dismissal. The pattern itself is curious. Why do so many cultures insist that their knowledge came from elsewhere? Why not celebrate invention as their own? The persistence of this theme suggests something deeper, perhaps memory encoded in myth, fragments of truth preserved in story when no stone or bone could endure. Consider the global flood myths, from the Mesopotamian tale of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, to Noah in the Bible, to stories told by tribes in the Americas, India, and Polynesia. They differ in details but share a common thread: a great destruction by water, survivors carrying fragments of knowledge into a new world. Geological studies confirm that at the end of the last ice age, seas rose more than 100 meters, swallowing coastlines where early people likely settled. If any advanced societies had grown along those shores, they would now lie hidden beneath the ocean. Perhaps the flood myths are memories of real events carried through generations. If memory of disaster can survive for thousands of years, perhaps memory of knowledge, too, can persist, disguised as stories of gods descending from the sky. The monuments amplify the mystery. Baalbek in Lebanon holds stones so massive, some weighing more than 1,000 tons, that even today we would need extraordinary machinery to move them. Puma Punku in Bolivia presents blocks cut with such precision that they resemble machine-made pieces, grooves and joints locking like puzzle parts. The Nazca lines stretch across the desert, images so large they can only be appreciated from the air. On Easter Island, Moai statues loom, carried across rugged terrain by a people with limited resources. Archaeologists explain these feats through ingenuity, labor, and persistence. And no doubt human effort was extraordinary. Yet the scale of precision and the abruptness with which these works appear give them an aura of being more than local achievements. They feel like echoes, fragments of something older that was remembered and expressed again. When you gather these puzzles into a single frame, they tell a story that is not smooth but jagged. Civilization emerges in bursts, knowledge appearing too complete, monuments too precise, myths too insistent. The ladder of progress does not rise step by step. It leaps as though built on memories of something already known. This does not mean we must leap to conclusions of aliens or lost continents, but it does mean the record invites questions, invites imagination, invites us to reconsider the boundaries of what we know. In the quiet spaces of history, where evidence is thin and stories grow louder, we face the possibility that our origins are stranger than textbooks allow. If life itself can travel across space, carried in comets as some scientists propose, then perhaps knowledge can travel too, carried in stories, symbols, or even in the collective memory of survivors. Perhaps civilization is not something invented once and for all, but something remembered, repeated, carried like a flame across ages and even across worlds. The sudden appearances in history may then be less like miracles and more like echoes, reminders of a song humanity has been singing longer than we realize. So when we stand at the edge of ruins, whether under the blazing sun of Egypt or in the shadow of jungle-covered pyramids, we are not simply tourists gazing at stone. We are witnesses to fragments of a deeper story, one that stretches beyond the reach of our written history. The silence of these places is not empty. It hums with questions. Why so sudden? Why so complete? Why us here, now? Each monument, each myth, each unexplained leap is a reminder that the ground we walk on may not be the true beginning. It may only be the latest stage of a journey that started long before Earth was ready to bear its weight. The story of sudden beginnings becomes even more unsettling when we look not only at monuments and cities, but at ourselves. For millions of years, human ancestors shaped stones into axes and flakes, gradually refining the edges but leaving a trail of continuity that feels slow and steady. Then, almost in an instant on the scale of evolution, Homo sapiens arrived with a mind capable of painting caves in France, with images that still pulse with life, carving figurines from ivory, and shaping flutes from bone to play music under the flicker of firelight. These were not mere survival tools, but expressions of imagination, symbolism, and spirit. They tell us that something changed, something that pushed humanity beyond instinct and into the realm of story and meaning. Archaeologists call this the Great Leap Forward, and it remains one of the most puzzling events in our past. Why did consciousness itself seem to ignite so suddenly, like a torch flaring to life in the darkness? Fossils and genetic studies give us glimpses of the path. We know that modern humans interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans, that our DNA carries fragments of those earlier cousins. Yet none of them left behind the same kind of symbolic record. They hunted, they made tools, they survived for millennia, but they did not build cities or inscribe laws. Why was it only our branch of the tree that suddenly looked at the stars and saw gods, counted seasons, and imagined eternity? Some scientists suggest a mutation in brain wiring, a change in how neurons fired, unlocking complex language or abstract thought. Others argue that environmental pressures forced groups to innovate quickly, pushing cooperation and imagination as survival tools. These are reasonable ideas, yet they do not erase the strange speed of the transformation. The first cave paintings are not awkward doodles, but masterpieces, full of motion, color, and perspective. It feels less like the birth of a skill and more like a memory resurfacing. The leap is not only mental but geographical. Within a relatively short time, humans spread to every continent except Antarctica. From the frozen tundra to dense rainforests, from deserts to Pacific islands, small groups managed to adapt, survive, and thrive. Archaeological evidence sometimes shows little in between, as if humans leapt from one place to another without leaving a continuous trail. The speed of migration is still debated. How did people with what appear to be simple boats cross vast oceans? How did they reach Australia tens of thousands of years ago, or the Americas perhaps earlier than our textbooks allow? Genetic evidence hints at waves of migration overlapping, disappearing, reappearing, leaving behind traces in unexpected places. The journey looks less like a straight line and more like a series of bold leaps, guided by knowledge we cannot fully trace. When we compare humanity to other species, the puzzle sharpens. For millions of years, life evolved slowly, each branch adapting within its limits. Then, in what feels like a blink of geological time, Homo sapiens emerged with the capacity for mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Our ancestors shared the planet with other hominins, yet none of them made the same leap. Random mutation, cultural accumulation, and chance may explain part of it, but the suddenness lingers like an echo. It is as if humanity was struck by a spark that others missed, a fire that leapt across generations and transformed survival into civilization. The artifacts tell the story in whispers. Tools stretch back millions of years, but suddenly we find jewelry made of shells, carvings of animals not seen in the region, and flutes that played melodies in caves where echoes turned sound into sacred experience. These are not objects of survival, but symbols of imagination. They suggest that humans were not simply living in the world, but creating worlds within their minds. This is where myth and archaeology meet, in the recognition that human consciousness is not just about eating, hunting, and reproducing, but about weaving meaning into the fabric of life. And yet, the origins of this symbolic behavior remain one of our greatest mysteries. Why did we begin to watch the stars with such devotion, tracking their movements and painting their cycles on rock? Why did we invest so much energy into carving monuments aligned with solstices and equinoxes, into shaping calendars and recording lunar cycles long before farming required precise seasons? These glimpses of science before necessity raise questions about where such knowledge came from. Did it arise from idle curiosity, from long nights staring at the sky, or was it memory, something carried forward from an older age? The strangeness grows when we look at the timing. The oldest evidence of symbolic art, ritual burials, and complex social structures seems to cluster, not spread evenly across time. Bursts of creativity appear in multiple regions, almost as though humanity woke up in unison. Why here, and why then? Perhaps the environment demanded it, but perhaps something else stirred, something that felt more like recollection than invention. Some scientists speak cautiously of panspermia, the idea that life itself may have arrived here from elsewhere, carried by comets or meteorites. If the building blocks of life traveled across space, then perhaps consciousness, too, is not entirely local. Perhaps the spark that ignited imagination is part of a larger pattern, one that repeats wherever conditions allow. In this view, we are not the first to awaken, but one chapter in a cosmic story of minds that rise suddenly, leap ahead, and leave behind monuments of memory. Even if we set aside such speculation, the questions remain. Why does consciousness feel like a cliff instead of a slope? Why does art appear fully realized, language complex, cities planned, and calendars precise, without a clear trail of half-finished steps? Mainstream archaeology continues to dig, uncovering fragments that may one day smooth the story, but for now the gaps remain wide. And in those gaps, imagination whispers. Maybe civilization is not the beginning, but the remembering, not the invention, but the repetition of something much older. When you stand in a cave where ancient hands painted horses galloping across stone, or when you watch the sun rise perfectly aligned with the stones at Stonehenge, you feel the weight of that mystery. The people who created these works were not stumbling in the dark. They knew what they were doing. They remembered something worth preserving in stone and paint, something that mattered enough to carry forward. And perhaps, just perhaps, what they remembered wasn't born here at all. Perhaps it was carried, whether through story, symbol, or even the very fabric of life, from a place we no longer recall. The leap into consciousness, into art, into imagination, is not just a question of history, but of identity. To understand it is to understand ourselves, not only as survivors of a long evolutionary path, but as inheritors of something deeper, something that arrived like a spark in the night and set our minds aflame. Whether that spark was chance, necessity, or memory from another world, it shaped everything that followed. It gave us gods, laws, calendars, cities, and the endless hunger to ask who we are and where we came from. That hunger itself may be the oldest inheritance of all, a reminder that our story begins not in certainty, but in questions, and that those questions reach far beyond the earth beneath our feet. To wander through the ruins of forgotten cities is to feel both awe and discomfort, because what the stones reveal often refuses to match the timeline we are taught. In Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization, Uruk appears around 3400 BCE, already crowned with monumental temples and streets laid with a sense of order. Clay tablets record transactions, offerings to gods, and observations of the sky. Writing, far from being crude sketches, arrives in its full complexity, already tied to systems of administration and astronomy. One would expect to find generations of half-formed alphabets or pictographs, a slow climb from marks to meaning. Instead, cuneiform stands before us like a completed invention, as though handed down rather than stumbled upon. Egypt tells a similar story. Within only a few centuries of its first dynasties, the Nile's people erected the Great Pyramid, a structure so precise that its base deviates by mere centimeters across 200 meters. To look at it is to feel as if one has stepped into the middle of a story rather than its beginning. Where are the rough drafts? Where are the smaller pyramids that should reveal the training of hands and minds before mastery? The Indus Valley deepens the enigma. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, with their rigidly aligned streets, advanced drainage, and standardized weights, appear without obvious predecessors. Their urban planning surpasses that of later cultures, yet the script they left behind remains undeciphered, a language locked tight, preventing us from hearing their voice. What little we know suggests a level of complexity that does not fit comfortably into the idea of gradual progress. In the Americas, the Olmec carved colossal heads of stone, each weighing many tons, each with distinct facial features that hint at rulers or ancestors. These works emerge suddenly around 1500 BCE without a trail of smaller experiments. Later, the Maya crafted one of the most sophisticated calendars in human history, tracking celestial movements with precision that rivaled anything known elsewhere. Their glyphs, like those of the Sumerians and Egyptians, appear in their finished state, not as awkward scratches, but as an already fluent system of writing. Across continents, the pattern is the same: monuments, scripts, and systems arriving not as seedlings, but as towering trees, already in bloom. This is why so many researchers outside the mainstream whisper about lost civilizations. Could it be that what we see as beginnings are in truth fragments of something older, remembered imperfectly, re-expressed in stone and story? The flood myths that echo across the world add to this suspicion. The Bible speaks of Noah, Mesopotamian epics of Utnapishtim, and traditions from India to the Americas tell of waters rising, swallowing worlds, leaving a few survivors to begin again. Geologists know that around 12,000 years ago, at the end of the Ice Age, seas rose dramatically, drowning coastlines where early people likely settled. If civilizations thrived along those shores, their remains would now lie hidden beneath oceans, leaving behind only stories of destruction carried forward in memory. Consider also the monuments that seem out of place in their time. At Baalbek in Lebanon, stone blocks weighing more than 1,000 tons rest in ancient foundations, their sheer size still baffling engineers. In Bolivia, Pumapunku displays andesite blocks cut with such accuracy that they interlock like modern prefabricated pieces. The Nazca lines stretch for kilometers across the desert floor, their designs visible only from the sky, their purpose still debated. On Easter Island, massive Moai statues stand as silent guardians, their transport across the island a feat not easily explained by simple tools. Mainstream archaeology offers answers: ramps, ropes, human ingenuity, and those answers deserve respect. But the sense of mismatch lingers, the feeling that these achievements belong to a level of knowledge not fully accounted for in their supposed context. When myths are placed beside monuments, the rhythm is hard to ignore. Sumerians credit the Anunnaki, Egyptians Osiris, Mesoamericans Quetzalcoatl, the Dogon beings from Sirius. Knowledge, they say, was given, not discovered. These stories may be symbolic, may represent the suddenness of inspiration or the personification of nature. But they could also be fragments of memory, distorted through centuries, yet still pointing back to a time when wisdom came from elsewhere. The universality of the theme, that culture descends from the sky, from the sea, from beyond, is striking. It invites us to wonder whether the leaps of civilization are less about invention than recollection, less about progress than continuity. Some argue that we underestimate the knowledge of hunter-gatherers, that they experimented with plants and animals for millennia, their achievements invisible only because they left no durable traces. Others point to climate shifts, to pressures that forced rapid innovation, to social changes that demanded cooperation on new scales. These explanations fit within the scientific framework, yet they do not dissolve the unease. They do not explain why, in so many different places, at roughly the same times, civilizations appear whole, with agriculture, writing, and monumental architecture ready at hand. The comparison to modern invention is revealing. When we study the history of the steam engine, the airplane, or the telephone, we see prototypes, failures, gradual refinement over decades. Early designs are clumsy, often forgotten, replaced by better versions until mastery is reached. But when we look at the birth of civilization, we see no such trail. We see only completed systems, as though the prototypes are missing, as though the memory of an earlier version survived and reappeared. This is why some call it not invention, but rebirth. To stand at Göbekli Tepe, the 12,000-year-old ceremonial complex in Turkey, is to face this question directly. The site predates agriculture, yet its massive carved pillars suggest organization, planning, and a vision of ritual life far beyond what nomads should have been capable of. Each stone bears animals and symbols, each circle arranged with intent. It is as if the people who built it remembered something the textbooks deny them. That memory may have come from an earlier culture lost to flood or fire, or, as some speculate, from influences beyond the earth itself. However we choose to interpret it, the stones insist that civilization is older, deeper, and more complex than the neat ladder of progress suggests. In the silence of these places, one hears not answers but echoes. Echoes of knowledge arriving too soon, echoes of myths that remember teachers from the sky, echoes of monuments that outlast explanation. To explore them is to accept that history is not a closed book, but a puzzle with missing pieces. The pieces we do have tell a story not of gradual invention, but of leaps, of sudden awakenings, of something given or remembered rather than painstakingly created. And in those gaps, we are invited to imagine. Perhaps we are not the first to walk this path. Perhaps we are not alone in carrying the torch of civilization. Perhaps our story began not here, but long before, waiting to be remembered. If we allow ourselves to linger in the space between myth and archaeology, we begin to sense that the past is not a straight line, but a labyrinth. Within that labyrinth lie the strange monuments that defy our expectations, structures that seem too advanced, too sudden, too deliberate for the times in which they were built. They stand scattered across the world, like markers of a forgotten memory, each whispering that the story we tell about ourselves may be incomplete. The Great Pyramid at Giza is perhaps the most iconic. Rising from the sands more than 4,000 years ago, it is the largest stone structure ever constructed, its base aligned with uncanny precision to the cardinal directions. Millions of limestone blocks, some weighing over 2 tons, are fitted so tightly that even a blade cannot slip between them. Mainstream archaeology explains the pyramid as the product of immense labor, clever use of ramps, and sheer human persistence. Yet no definitive evidence of construction methods has been found, only theories. What deepens the mystery is that the Great Pyramid is not preceded by a visible series of smaller, clumsy attempts. Instead, it emerges full-grown, unmatched by later pyramids that are smaller, less precise, more experimental. Why does the greatest achievement stand at the beginning, as if the builders were remembering rather than learning? Travel north to Lebanon, and you encounter the ruins of Baalbek. There, in the foundations of an ancient temple complex, lie some of the largest stone blocks ever used in construction. The stone of the pregnant woman weighs more than 1,000 tons, a single block larger than anything moved in recorded history until modern times. Some remain in the quarry, as though abandoned by builders who worked on a scale beyond necessity. How were they moved, if they were moved at all? Why use blocks of such unimaginable size when smaller stones would have sufficed? The mainstream answer invokes coordinated labor, rollers, and ramps, but the sheer scale provokes wonder. It feels like a fragment of knowledge not entirely belonging to its time. In South America, the mystery grows sharper. At Pumapunku, part of the Tiwanaku complex in Bolivia, enormous andesite blocks lie scattered, many carved with precision that seems almost mechanical. Grooves, notches, and interlocking shapes resemble pieces of a giant stone puzzle. The hardness of andesite makes such precision cutting difficult even with modern tools, yet the surfaces are smooth, the angles exact. Archaeologists attribute the site to a culture that thrived around 1,500 years ago, but the techniques remain puzzling. Were these stones truly carved with primitive tools, or do they represent a survival of knowledge from an earlier age, preserved and applied with uncanny skill? Then there are the Nazca lines in Peru, etched across the desert floor into vast designs of animals, plants, and geometric shapes. Some stretch for kilometers, perfectly straight, while others form figures so large they can only be fully appreciated from the sky. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. The lines were created by removing the dark top layer of stones to reveal lighter soil beneath, guided by simple surveying techniques. Yet their purpose remains a riddle. Why create images visible only from above? Were they astronomical markers, ritual pathways, or messages to the gods? Whatever their meaning, the scale and precision suggest planning and knowledge beyond what we expect from the time. Far across the Pacific, on Easter Island, the Moai statues gaze inland with solemn eyes. Each massive figure was carved from volcanic rock and transported across rugged terrain by the Rapa Nui people. Some weigh more than 80 tons. Theories abound, rolling on logs, dragging with ropes, or even walking upright through coordinated movements. But the sheer number of statues and the distance they traveled make the feat extraordinary. More mysterious still is the sudden halt in construction, as though the society that raised them collapsed or abandoned the practice abruptly, leaving the Moai as silent reminders of a knowledge lost. These monuments are not isolated. From Stonehenge in England, aligned with the solstices, to the step pyramids of Mesoamerica, to the megalithic temples of Malta, the pattern repeats. Ancient peoples built on scales and with precision that feels disproportionate to the tools we assign to them. Archaeology explains each case within the framework of human ingenuity and persistence, and there is no doubt that those qualities were abundant. Yet, when we look at them collectively, spread across continents and separated by oceans, they form a pattern too consistent to ignore. Everywhere, monuments appear fully formed, aligned with stars, speaking of knowledge in surveying, geometry, and astronomy that should have taken much longer to develop. One possibility is that these are not inventions but survivals, fragments of older knowledge carried through collapse and rediscovered in stone. If a civilization once thrived before the end of the Ice Age, most of its traces would be gone. Wood, textiles, and metal erased by time, floods, and erosion. Only the largest and most durable works, carved from stone, would endure. Later cultures may have inherited them, repurposed them, or repeated their forms. This would explain why so many structures feel out of place, why some look older than the civilizations that supposedly built them. Another possibility is that knowledge itself travels not only through time, but across space. If life can move on comets and meteorites, as some scientists suggest, perhaps culture can migrate too, carried in stories, myths, or even genetic memory. Civilization may not begin in one place, but ripple outward, each wave carrying echoes of the one before. The monuments remind us that stone holds memory. Where wood rots and fabric decays, stone endures, preserving fragments of stories long forgotten. Yet endurance is not clarity. The stones do not explain themselves. They leave us to guess, to reconstruct, to argue, and to imagine. And in that space of imagination, we confront possibilities that stretch beyond the borders of conventional history. Perhaps these monuments are not just feats of human persistence, but signals, echoes of civilizations older than we dare to admit, or even influences from beyond Earth. Even if we resist such speculation, the monuments remain as puzzles. They tell us that human beings were capable of extraordinary feats earlier than expected, that our ancestors were not primitive in the way we sometimes imagine. They remind us that knowledge can appear suddenly, fully formed, and then vanish again, leaving only stone as a witness. Whether explained by lost civilizations, forgotten techniques, or something stranger still, the monuments insist that the story of civilization is more complex than the straight line of progress we often draw. They are the anchors of mystery, holding in place the question that hums through every ruin. What came before us, and how much have we forgotten? To walk among them is to feel the weight of that question. The air around the stones seems charged with memory, not only of the people who carved and lifted them, but of something older, something deeper. They ask us not simply to admire their scale, but to consider the gaps in our knowledge, to recognize that history as we know it may be only a fragment. In their silence, the monuments speak, telling us that civilization is not only about what we build, but about what we remember, and that memory may stretch further back, perhaps even further outward, than we have yet dared to imagine. The silence of ruins is heavy, but it is not empty. If you listen long enough, you begin to hear the murmurs of memory woven into myth. Myths, after all, are not just stories to entertain by the fire. They are carriers of memory, fragments of knowledge pressed into symbols and images, repeated across generations until the original event dissolves into legend. When we compare the myths of distant cultures, separated by oceans and centuries, what surprises us is not their differences, but their strange similarities. The Sumerians, among the earliest civilizations we know, spoke of the Anunnaki, beings from the heavens who came down to teach them the skills of agriculture, kingship, and writing. These were not vague gods of storms or rivers, but figures tied directly to the foundation of organized society. In Egypt, the people remembered Osiris, a god who was said to have brought laws, rituals, and the knowledge of farming to the Nile. He was described not as an eternal spirit of the land, but as a stranger, someone who arrived from elsewhere and bestowed civilization upon those who had none. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs and Maya told of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who crossed seas to bring calendars, sciences, and wisdom. He too eventually departed, promising one day to return. In West Africa, the Dogon preserved a cosmology in which beings descended from Sirius, a star system invisible in its full complexity until modern telescopes revealed it as binary. For the Dogon to have known this without advanced instruments is unsettling, unless their story carries fragments of something older passed down in myth disguised as memory. Across the Pacific, Polynesian traditions speak of ancestors who arrived by canoe, not just from across the sea, but from the stars, guided by constellations. The Hindu Vedas describe Vimanas, flying chariots of the gods, while the Devas and Asuras are said to have descended from the heavens to interact with humanity. In North America, tribes like the Iroquois told of Sky Woman who fell from the heavens and shaped the world, while the Lakota remembered star people who came down to teach and guide. The details vary, but the rhythm is consistent. Civilization did not begin alone, but with visitors, teachers, bringers of knowledge who came from elsewhere. Why is this theme so common? Why do cultures across the world tell stories of arrivals from the sky, the sea, or beyond? If myths were only metaphors, we might expect them to diverge according to local needs. Gods of rain for farmers, gods of hunt for hunters. Yet again and again, we find the same narrative pattern, as if humanity collectively remembers an encounter too important to forget. One explanation is symbolic. The sky has always been the canvas of human imagination, its stars marking the passage of time, its storms shaping survival. To say that wisdom came from the sky might be another way of saying that knowledge felt sudden, as though it descended rather than grew. Another explanation is cultural memory of earthly encounters. Perhaps new groups of people, more advanced in technology, arrived in distant lands, bringing agriculture, language, or tools. To those who received them, it might have seemed as though gods themselves had come. These explanations are sober and possible, yet they do not erase the uncanny consistency of the theme. When the same story appears in Sumer, Egypt, Mesoamerica, West Africa, Polynesia, and North America, it begins to feel less like coincidence and more like the echo of something real, though distorted by time. Flood myths add to this echo. In Mesopotamia, Utnapishtim survives a deluge in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the Bible, Noah builds an ark. In India, Manu is saved by a fish who warns him of rising waters. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha repopulate the world after a great flood. In the Americas, tribes tell of waters that swallowed lands, leaving survivors to begin anew. These stories may reflect real geological events at the end of the Ice Age, when glaciers melted and seas rose more than 100 meters, drowning coasts where early humans likely lived. If cities and societies thrived there, their ruins now rest deep under the sea, their stories surviving only as myths of destruction. Survivors would carry fragments of knowledge forward into the next age, remembering it not as invention, but as inheritance. Atlantis, described by Plato as an advanced civilization destroyed in a single night of disaster, fits into this rhythm. Scholars often dismiss it as allegory, but it could be a memory of real events distorted over centuries. Whether or not Atlantis existed as described, the story reflects a deeper theme. Civilizations rise, flourish, and collapse, leaving behind only echoes. If survivors carried fragments forward, then the sudden beginnings we see in Mesopotamia, Egypt, or the Indus Valley may not be true beginnings at all, but continuations. If we view myths as memory rather than fantasy, they take on new weight. The Anunnaki may not be literal beings from another planet, but they may represent a memory of teachers from a lost culture, remembered as gods because their knowledge seemed divine. Quetzalcoatl may symbolize the arrival of new technologies from across the ocean, preserved in story as a feathered serpent. The Dogon's serious knowledge may be coincidence, or it may reflect a fragment of astronomical understanding preserved longer than expected. The point is not to decide whether each myth is literal, but to recognize that their persistence across time and place points to a deeper truth. Humanity does not see itself as having invented civilization alone. We remember it as given. What makes this even more compelling is that myths often describe not only gifts of knowledge, but departures. The teachers arrive, bestow wisdom, and then leave, promising to return or fading into legend. This pattern suggests discontinuity, as if the knowledge did not remain whole but fragmented, carried forward imperfectly by those left behind. This could explain why early civilizations appear fully formed, yet sometimes collapse quickly, as though they inherited more than they could sustain. The Indus Valley, with its advanced planning, disappears around 1900 BCE. The Maya, with their calendars and cities, fall into decline centuries later. Each leaves behind ruins that suggest a level of knowledge greater than what followed, as though the fragments slipped away. Seen this way, myths are not fanciful tales, but survival tools. They encode fragments of memory into story, ensuring that even if details are lost, the essence remains. Over generations, metaphors take the place of specifics. Gods replace teachers, and miracles replace techniques. Yet the memory survives, waiting for archaeologists, historians, and dreamers to recognize it. If myths across the world tell us that knowledge came from beyond, perhaps it is because deep down we remember that it did. From ancestors displaced by floods, from strangers arriving with seeds and symbols, or even from sources beyond Earth itself. In the end, myths are both fragile and powerful. They are fragile because details shift, symbols change, and centuries blur reality into legend. They are powerful because they endure where facts do not, carrying memory through time when monuments crumble and records are erased. They remind us that civilization may not be as local or as recent as we assume. They suggest that humanity has always known, at some level, that we are part of a larger story, one in which knowledge is not only discovered but given, not only created but remembered. And whether we interpret that story literally or symbolically, it tells us the same thing. The origins of civilization are older, stranger, and more mysterious than we imagine, and the myths that survive are not decorations on history, but doorways back into it. If myths are fragments of memory, then the sky itself is the canvas upon which those fragments are painted. Across the world, ancient structures show an obsession with the heavens that seems to go beyond simple curiosity. The stars were not just lights scattered across the night, but guides, calendars, and even teachers. Civilizations aligned their monuments with solstices, equinoxes, and constellations, leaving behind stone markers that connect earth and sky in ways we are still deciphering. Stonehenge in England is perhaps the most famous example. Its massive stones, arranged in circles, align with the sunrise of the summer solstice and the sunset of the winter solstice. To stand there at dawn on the longest day of the year is to witness light threading through ancient architecture, binding human ritual to cosmic rhythm. This was not coincidence. It was deliberate, a reminder that early people knew the sky intimately, tracking it with precision that belies the idea of primitive stargazers. In Egypt, the Great Pyramid's shafts align with Orion's belt and Sirius, two celestial features deeply tied to their mythology. Orion was associated with Osiris, the god of rebirth, while Sirius marked the rising of the Nile, the lifeblood of Egyptian agriculture. This is not just engineering but cosmology written into stone. The pyramid becomes more than a tomb. It becomes a map, a bridge between the earthly and the divine. Similarly, the Temple of Karnak aligns with the midwinter solstice, while Abu Simbel is designed so that twice a year the rising sun illuminates statues deep inside its sanctuary. These feats show not only architectural skill, but astronomical mastery, the ability to calculate solar and stellar cycles with stunning accuracy. The Maya, too, lived by the sky. Their cities were built as cosmic diagrams, with temples aligned to Venus, the sun, and the moon. At Chichen Itza, during the equinox, shadows cast by the pyramid of Kukulkan create the illusion of a serpent slithering down the steps, uniting architecture with celestial motion. Their calendar, more precise than the Gregorian system, tracked cycles of the sun, moon, and planets with astonishing fidelity. To them, time itself was sacred, a weaving of cosmic patterns into human life. In the Andes, the Nazca lines stretch across the desert in straight lines, and figures that some believe align with constellations, though their full meaning remains elusive. At Machu Picchu, the Intihuatana stone, the hitching post of the sun, aligns with the equinox, anchoring the sun's journey in stone. Even in remote islands, the sky ruled. Polynesians navigated vast oceans using only stars, swells, and clouds, crossing thousands of miles with accuracy that astonishes modern sailors. Their oral traditions encoded constellations as maps, songs as guides, turning the heavens into a living compass. The Dogon of Mali described Sirius not only as a star, but as a system with an invisible companion, knowledge confirmed only with modern telescopes. Whether coincidence, intuition, or inherited knowledge, such insights suggest a relationship with the sky deeper than survival required. Why were ancient peoples so obsessed with the heavens? Part of the answer is practical. The stars mark seasons, guiding planting and harvest. The sun and moon structure time, anchoring rituals and ceremonies. But there is also something more. To watch the stars is to feel small and connected at once, to sense rhythms larger than human life. Aligning monuments with the sky is not only about utility, but about placing humanity within the cosmos, weaving the earthly story into a cosmic one. Yet the precision of these alignments suggests more than reverence. It suggests knowledge, systematic observation, mathematical calculation, and the ability to record and transmit data across generations. How did they acquire such knowledge so early? And why did it appear fully formed? The mainstream explanation is patience. Over centuries, observers could track celestial cycles, noting patterns and passing them down. With enough time, accuracy accumulates. But the monuments challenge this view. They appear suddenly, already aligned, already precise, as if the knowledge was not slowly built but already possessed. The Maya calendar doesn't look like the work of trial and error, but of mastery. The Great Pyramid doesn't look like the first attempt, but the culmination of something older. And when such mastery appears across continents, the puzzle deepens. Were these cultures connected in ways we do not understand? Or were they all remembering fragments of a deeper tradition that predated them all? Some researchers suggest that the obsession with Orion, Sirius, and the Pleiades across cultures points to a shared memory. The Pleiades, a cluster of stars visible in every hemisphere, appear in myths from Greece to Japan to the Americas. Why did so many cultures fixate on the same stars? Was it simply their brightness and beauty? Or did these stars hold symbolic weight because they were once tied to an origin story, perhaps even a place of origin? If myths speak of beings who descended from the sky and monuments align with specific constellations, could it be that the stars themselves were remembered as home, or as markers of a journey humanity once took? Skeptics argue that humans everywhere looked up at the same sky, so similarities are inevitable. Yet the specific repetition of Orion, Sirius, and the Pleiades across thousands of years and miles is harder to dismiss. These stars become threads weaving human cultures together into a single cosmic tapestry. They suggest that the memory of the sky is not only local but global, part of a shared inheritance older than writing. If the sky was the first book humanity read, then monuments were its libraries, preserving alignments in stone long after oral traditions faded. They remind us that civilization was never only about survival, but about meaning, about locating ourselves within the vastness. But they also remind us of the mystery. Why so sudden? Why so precise? Why so consistent across distant cultures? Perhaps the stars themselves carry the answer, or perhaps they only reflect back our own longing for origin. Either way, they stand as silent witnesses, constant above while civilizations rise and fall below. In the end, the heavens are both mirror and map. They mirror our desire to understand who we are, projecting myths and gods onto constellations. They map our place in time, anchoring calendars and guiding journeys. And in their constancy, they hold memory, reminding us that civilization's roots are not only in the soil, but in the stars. To follow those roots is to admit that history is not confined to Earth, that our story stretches outward into the cosmos. Whether we interpret that literally or metaphorically, the truth is the same. Humanity has always been a child of the sky, and the monuments we leave behind are not only temples of stone, but messages to the stars, echoes of a memory we cannot quite name. When we speak of civilization, we often imagine it as a tree rooted in one place, growing upward over time. But what if civilization was not tied to a single soil? What if, instead, it was more like a wandering fire, carried from place to place, reignited wherever conditions allowed? The idea of a migrating civilization changes the way we think about our beginnings. It suggests that knowledge and culture are not only born where we find them, but remembered, transplanted, adapted, and reborn, like seeds scattered across the world. This is not entirely foreign to us even now. Empires rise and fall, but their ideas travel, carried by traders, refugees, or conquerors. Rome fell, yet Roman law and architecture survived in Europe and beyond. Greece declined, but its philosophy and science were carried into the Islamic world, then back to the West. Knowledge is rarely tied forever to the soil where it first emerges. Why should prehistory have been any different? If we imagine a civilization before the end of the last ice age, one that flourished along coasts now drowned by rising seas, its people would have been forced to move when the waters rose. Survivors may have carried fragments of knowledge inland: how to build with stone, how to track stars, how to plant crops. Their descendants may not have had the resources to replicate the greatness of their lost world, but they could preserve pieces of it, embedding them in monuments, myths, and rituals. Over time, those fragments would seem to appear suddenly, like sparks flaring in the darkness, in places as far apart as Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Andes, or Polynesia. To archaeologists, they look like abrupt inventions. To those who lived them, they may have felt like memory. Consider the seafaring traditions that still echo in the Pacific. Polynesians crossed thousands of miles of open ocean with no compasses, guided only by the stars, swells, and the flight of birds. To Europeans who first encountered them, such navigation seemed impossible, yet it had been practiced for generations. If a culture in deep prehistory mastered ocean travel, its survivors could have spread fragments of their knowledge across the globe. This could explain why pyramids rise in both Egypt and Mesoamerica, why flood myths echo on every continent, why astronomy appears so suddenly in multiple regions. The monuments may not prove a single global civilization, but they hint at a shared memory carried by migrating peoples who once knew more than we assume. The idea of a migrating civilization also explains the puzzle of sudden collapse. Cultures like the Indus Valley or the Maya built cities of astonishing complexity, only to vanish mysteriously. Perhaps they were not the first to carry the torch, but one link in a longer chain, inheriting fragments of knowledge but unable to sustain them in the face of drought, war, or disease. When they fell, the memory fragmented further, passed down through story and ritual, waiting to resurface again. This cycle of rise, fall, and remembrance may be the true rhythm of human history. Not a straight line, but a series of waves. Skeptics might argue that there is no evidence of such a lost civilization. And it is true. We have not uncovered definitive ruins beneath the sea that prove its existence. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Coastlines are dynamic. Cities built of wood, clay, and fiber would not survive 12,000 years of tides and storms. The ocean hides secrets well. Even on land, much of archaeology remains buried. We have explored only a fraction of the Earth's surface in detail, and discoveries like Göbekli Tepe remind us how much can lie hidden for millennia. If one site could sleep beneath the soil for 11,000 years, how many others remain unseen, their stones still waiting to rise into the light? We can also see this pattern in cultural memory. Myths often speak of golden ages before catastrophe. The Greeks told of ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, each declining from the last. Hindu tradition describes yugas, vast cycles in which humanity rises and falls. Mesoamerican myths speak of suns, or worlds destroyed and reborn. These stories may not be literal, but they suggest an intuition that civilization is not a one-time event, but a repeating cycle. If that is true, then our present world is not the first, and perhaps not the last. Even linguistics hints at forgotten migrations. The spread of Indo-European languages across Eurasia suggests ancient movements of peoples carrying not only words, but ideas, myths, and technologies. Oral traditions often preserve surprising accuracy over thousands of years, encoding details of landscapes, animals, and events long since changed. If language can carry memory across millennia, why not civilization itself, preserved in fragments until conditions allowed it to blossom again? What is striking is how often survivors describe their knowledge as a gift from elsewhere. When Polynesians recall their ancestors guided by the stars, they speak not just of skill, but of connection to the cosmos. When the Dogon describe beings from Sirius, they frame their astronomy as inheritance, not invention. When Egyptians tell of Osiris, or Sumerians of the Anunnaki, they describe knowledge as something brought, not born. This could be poetic metaphor, or it could reflect the truth of migrating civilizations, carrying fragments from places now lost, remembered as divine, because they came from a world destroyed. If we look at civilization as a traveling flame, not a rooted tree, many puzzles become less puzzling. Sudden leaps of agriculture, writing, and astronomy may be less sudden than they appear, the result of memory carried across generations. Monumental architecture may be echoes of older designs, scaled down or adapted by cultures that only partially remembered the original techniques. The obsession with stars may reflect not only practical need, but ancestral memory of guidance across oceans, or perhaps even across greater distances. This perspective also changes how we see ourselves. We are not the first to build cities, to chart the sky, to imagine eternity. We are the inheritors of countless forgotten attempts, fragments carried forward by those who refused to let the fire die. Civilization is less a triumph of progress than a story of resilience, of memory surviving collapse, of knowledge migrating across space and time. And if that is true, then the monuments we marvel at are not just feats of engineering, but messages, reminders that humanity has walked this path before and may walk it again. The idea of a migrating civilization is humbling. It tells us that our greatness may not be unique, that we are part of a cycle larger than any empire. It suggests that the question of origin may never have a single answer, because civilization itself may not have a single birthplace. It may be a wandering fire, carried by hands now dust, leaving behind sparks in stone and myth, waiting to be reignited in each new age. And as we look at the ruins around us, we may feel not only curiosity but kinship, recognizing in them the echoes of travelers who once carried the same flame we hold now. The rhythm of civilization is not only measured in monuments and myths, but also in its collapses. If we look closely at history, what strikes us is not just how quickly societies rise, but how suddenly they fall. The Indus Valley, with its meticulously planned cities, advanced drainage systems, and standardized weights, vanished around 1900 BCE. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were abandoned, their script undeciphered, their culture fading into silence. The Maya, who charted the heavens with extraordinary precision and built cities like Tikal and Palenque in the dense jungles, collapsed between the 9th and 10th centuries CE, leaving behind pyramids swallowed by trees. In the Mediterranean, the Bronze Age world crumbled around 1200 BCE, when cities from Greece to Anatolia burned or were abandoned, literacy declined, and trade networks shattered. It was a global crisis, a dark age that lasted centuries. The question echoes across all these collapses. How can societies capable of such brilliance vanish so completely? Archaeologists offer explanations: climate change, drought, resource depletion, internal conflict, invasions, and no doubt these played roles. But what is strange is the suddenness. The way collapse often comes like a curtain falling, leaving ruins too sophisticated to match the cultures that follow. After the Bronze Age collapse, for example, Greek society reverted to simpler forms, and writing was lost for centuries before re-emerging. The Maya's successors did not sustain their advanced astronomical systems. The Indus script was forgotten entirely. Collapse does not look like a slow fading out. It looks like memory being severed. It feels as though knowledge itself was lost, as if a torch was dropped, and darkness rushed in before someone else managed to pick it up again. This recurring pattern raises unsettling questions. If civilization has fallen before, how many times? The further back we look, the more the record becomes a blur of fragments. We may be seeing only the latest wave, the survivors of previous rises and falls, each carrying fragments of memory into a new age. Myths of golden ages followed by destruction begin to make sense in this light. The Greeks spoke of ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, each less perfect than the last. The Hindus describe vast yugas, cycles of rising virtue followed by decline. The Aztecs spoke of previous suns, worlds destroyed and remade. These stories echo the archaeological record, where civilizations rise suddenly, achieve greatness, and collapse just as suddenly. The flood myths fit neatly into this rhythm. If rising seas at the end of the Ice Age drowned coastal civilizations, their survivors would carry memories of a destroyed world. To those who inherited their stories, the knowledge of the old world would seem like a divine gift, but also fragile, prone to being lost again. Collapse, then, is not only destruction, but forgetting. And forgetting may explain why so many achievements appear sudden in the record. They were not new inventions, but rediscoveries, fragments pieced together after catastrophe. When we marvel at the Great Pyramid or the Maya calendar, perhaps we are marveling at the resilience of memory as much as the brilliance of invention. Take the mysterious site of Göbekli Tepe. Its stone pillars and carvings date back more than 11,000 years before agriculture was thought to exist. The people who built it may have been the last inheritors of knowledge from an earlier age, building one final monument before their world disappeared. Afterward, agriculture emerged in the same region, as though the memory carried by the builders finally took root in fields. Was this a true beginning? Or was it a continuation of something older carried forward through collapse? The pattern suggests the latter. The idea that civilization is cyclical rather than linear changes how we see ourselves. We often think of progress as a straight climb, each generation building higher. But the ruins tell a different story. They tell of rises and falls, of brilliance followed by forgetting, of torches lit and dropped and lit again. If this is true, then our own world is part of the cycle, not outside it. The skyscrapers, satellites, and digital networks we build may one day be ruins, puzzling future archaeologists the way we puzzle over Baalbek or Puma Punku. To them, our world may seem sudden, inexplicable, out of place, an echo of something older. The fragility of memory is key. Knowledge depends on preservation, on continuity. A single catastrophe, drought, war, plague, or flood, can break the chain. Writing systems vanish, skills are lost, technologies forgotten. We see this even in smaller examples. Roman concrete, which lasted millennia, was forgotten after the empire fell, its formula only recently rediscovered. The Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek device capable of tracking planetary motions, survived only as a corroded fragment in a shipwreck, its existence unknown for 2,000 years. If such knowledge could vanish in the relatively recent past, how much more could have been lost in deeper time, swept away by collapses we no longer remember? There is also a psychological element. Societies in decline often turn inward, their energy spent on survival rather than preservation. Libraries burn, monuments crumble, oral traditions fray. What remains is myth, fragments wrapped in story, passed down without context. This is why so many myths speak of destruction, of gods punishing humanity, of worlds ending in flood or fire. They are the shadows of real collapses, encoded in narrative to outlast memory. When archaeologists uncover ruins, they find the stones, but not the stories, the monuments, but not the meaning. Without the continuity of memory, we are left with puzzles that feel abrupt, inexplicable, as though knowledge came from nowhere. Perhaps this is why so many ancient traditions emphasize cycles. The Maya believed time itself was cyclical, repeating in great rounds. Hindu cosmology describes creation and destruction as eternal processes. Even the Greeks, with their ages of decline, hinted that progress was not inevitable, but temporary. These traditions may not be philosophy alone, but cultural memory of collapses, recognition that greatness is fragile, that civilizations rise and fall like waves. What does this mean for us today? It means we are not the first to build, and perhaps not the first to fall. It means our skyscrapers and satellites are not immune to the forces that toppled pyramids and drained cities. It means the greatest danger is not only destruction, but forgetting. If our systems collapse, what knowledge will survive? Will future generations remember us as gods who walked the earth, as myths of a golden age, as builders of monuments they cannot explain? Perhaps they will see us the way we see the Maya or the Indus Valley, as sudden brilliance followed by silence. To walk through ruins is to feel this fragility. The stones stand, but the meaning has faded. The knowledge that once animated them is gone, leaving only questions. Collapse is not only about endings, but about memory's failure, and in that failure lies the true mystery of civilization. Not why we build, but why we forget. If we are indeed part of a cycle, then our challenge is to break it, to preserve memory beyond collapse, to ensure that the fire of knowledge is not extinguished but carried forward. Yet perhaps forgetting is inevitable, part of the rhythm of human life, part of the way civilizations breathe, rising, falling, and rising again. And so we return to the central enigma. Are we witnessing the first civilization, or the latest in a long chain? The ruins suggest the latter. They whisper that we are inheritors, not originators, that our brilliance is built on fragments of memory carried across ages of collapse. If that is true, then our task is not only to build higher, but to remember deeper, to honor the echoes of forgotten worlds, and to recognize in their silence the possibility that we, too, may one day be remembered only in myth. To understand the mystery of our beginnings, it helps to think of civilization not just as stone and writing, but as memory itself. What we call history is the fragile attempt to preserve memory across generations. Yet the deeper we go, the more it dissolves into silence. The silence is not empty, however. It is filled with fragments, myths, ruins, alignments with the stars that suggest humanity has been remembering and forgetting in cycles far older than the textbooks admit. This tension between remembering and forgetting is perhaps the essence of our story. For every monument that endures, countless others have vanished. For every myth that survives, many have been lost. The gaps are as important as the evidence. because they remind us that civilization is less a straight line and more a flickering light, bright for a moment, then dim, then rekindled. Consider how fragile knowledge really is. The Library of Alexandria, said to have housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls, burned more than once, each fire erasing voices we will never recover. The knowledge of ancient medicine, astronomy, and philosophy was lost, preserved only in fragments that later generations had to rediscover. When Rome fell, technologies like aqueducts and concrete disappeared with it. The Dark Ages in Europe were not devoid of knowledge, but much was forgotten, locked in monasteries or scattered in fragments. These are recent examples. If so much can vanish in just a few centuries, what might have been lost in the thousands of years before writing? It is in this light that we must read the ruins. Göbekli Tepe is older than agriculture, yet it is a masterpiece of symbolic architecture. Pumapunku's stones are cut with precision that challenges our assumptions about ancient tools. The Great Pyramid stands as a monument unmatched by later attempts. These are not beginnings. They are continuations, fragments of memory preserved in stone when other materials failed. Perhaps the builders were not inventing but remembering, trying to anchor in permanence what would otherwise be lost. Myths serve the same purpose. They encode memory into story, so that even when writing is gone, fragments survive in ritual, song, and legend. Flood myths, star myths, myths of gods descending from the sky. These may be the distorted memories of real events, preserved through forgetting. We see this even in the details of myth. The Sumerians credited the Anunnaki with kingship and agriculture. The Egyptians spoke of Osiris as a bringer of law and farming. The Maya remembered Quetzalcoatl as a teacher of calendars and astronomy. The Dogon knew of Sirius as a binary system. These are not vague tales, but specific gifts: agriculture, law, astronomy, kingship, each a cornerstone of civilization. That such specificity repeats across cultures suggests something deeper than coincidence. It suggests memory, distorted but persistent, echoing across continents. Skeptics argue that such stories reflect human imagination, that all cultures naturally develop myths of gods who bring order. But if imagination alone were the cause, why do so many myths describe knowledge as coming from outside, from the sky, from strangers? Why not simply celebrate human invention? The consistency across cultures is striking. It is as if humanity collectively remembers that civilization was not invented in isolation, but inherited, carried forward through collapse and catastrophe. The stars reinforce this pattern. Monuments across the world are aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and constellations. Orion, Sirius, and the Pleiades appear again and again in myths and architecture, from Egypt to Mesoamerica to Polynesia. These stars are not the brightest or most obvious, yet they hold disproportionate importance. Why? Perhaps because they were markers of memory, associated with origins or journeys, remembered long after the details were forgotten. When the Great Pyramid points to Orion, or when the Maya track Venus with precision, they are not simply measuring the sky. They are remembering a cosmic story. Whether that story is symbolic or literal, it binds humanity to the heavens in ways we still struggle to explain. What emerges from all this is a picture of civilization as fragile, cyclical, and deeply entangled with memory. It is not a straight climb from caves to cities, but a series of rises and falls, each leaving fragments for the next. It is not purely local, but global, with echoes of similar myths and monuments across continents. It is not solely human invention, but a process of remembering, of carrying forward knowledge in stories and stones when everything else is lost. This perspective does not require us to embrace fantasies of alien gods or lost continents, though such possibilities cannot be dismissed entirely. It only requires us to accept that the story of civilization is older and more complex than the neat ladder we are taught. If civilization is memory, then we are its latest inheritors. Our skyscrapers, satellites, and networks are monuments of their own, fragile in their way, dependent on power grids, servers, and fragile economies. Should they collapse, what would remain? Concrete and steel crumble quickly compared to stone. Digital memory is ephemeral, easily erased. 1,000 years from now, how much of our world will be visible? Perhaps only fragments, puzzling future archaeologists. Perhaps myths of flying machines, of glowing screens, of towers that touched the sky will survive, remembered as stories of gods. To them, our world may seem sudden, inexplicable, out of place, just as we see the Great Pyramid or Puma Punku. This recognition is humbling. It reminds us that we are not outside the cycle of remembering and forgetting, but deeply within it. Our task is not only to build, but to preserve, to ensure that memory survives collapse. But perhaps collapse and forgetting are inevitable, part of the rhythm of humanity. Perhaps the point is not to escape the cycle, but to carry the flame forward, even if it flickers. Each age inherits fragments of the last, reimagines them, and passes them on. Civilization is not one story, but many, a chain of memory stretching back into prehistory, perhaps even beyond. And so we find ourselves standing among ruins, listening to myths, watching the stars, piecing together fragments of memory. We may never know the full story, but perhaps that is not the point. Perhaps the point is to recognize that the story is larger than we are, that it stretches beyond the borders of history, into myth, into the cosmos, into the silence of what has been forgotten. In that silence, we find not emptiness, but possibility, the invitation to imagine, to remember, to carry the flame forward. Civilization, then, is not just about cities and laws and monuments. It is about memory, fragile, cyclical, enduring, and the human hunger to know who we are and where we came from. To step back from the ruins and the myths is to notice something even more profound. The story of civilization is not only about structures and systems, but about the human mind itself. At some point, long before written history, consciousness shifted. We began to imagine futures, to tell stories, to create symbols. That shift is what archaeologists call the cognitive revolution, a sudden burst of symbolic thought and abstract reasoning. It shows itself in cave paintings of France and Spain, in carved figurines of lions and women, in burial sites where bodies were laid with tools, flowers, or jewelry. These are not the acts of creatures struggling only to survive. They are the gestures of beings aware of meaning, of death, of the unseen. What makes this leap strange is that it appears so abruptly. For hundreds of thousands of years, stone tools changed little. Then suddenly art, ritual, and story flourished as though a switch had been flipped in the human mind. This leap into imagination may be the true beginning of civilization. 'Cause without imagination, there can be no myth, no law, no architecture, no calendar. But where did it come from? Some scientists suggest a mutation in brain structure allowed for complex language, enabling us to share ideas across generations. Others argue that social pressures demanded more cooperation and creativity, pushing minds to innovate or perish. Still others point to environmental change, where shifting climates forced adaptation in thought as much as in tools. All of these may be true, but they do not explain the abruptness. Why did symbolic thought emerge so suddenly, and why did it carry such weight that within a short time, humans were painting horses on cave walls with precision and grace, crafting bone flutes to play melodies, and carving idols that embodied concepts far beyond survival? Perhaps imagination was always there, waiting, and some event unlocked it. Perhaps it was not an invention, but a remembering. Myths themselves suggest as much. They often describe humanity as having once been closer to gods or stars, only to lose that connection and struggle to regain it. The idea of a lost golden age, repeated across cultures, may symbolize the memory of a time when imagination was fresh, when humans saw the world with clarity before it was forgotten. If so, then every act of art and ritual is not just creativity, but remembrance, a reaching back to something we once had in full. The role of myth in shaping imagination cannot be overstated. To tell a story is to create a shared reality, to bind people together in a vision larger than themselves. The myths of the Anunnaki, Osiris, Quetzalcoatl, and the Star People are not just explanations. They are frameworks, lenses through which entire societies organized their lives. By rooting their origins in the heavens or in divine teachers, ancient peoples gave meaning to their monuments, their rituals, their calendars. They created a worldview where the human was not separate from the cosmos, but a continuation of it. This is the foundation of civilization. Shared imagination, encoded in story, sustained in ritual, and written in stone. When we look at ancient monuments through this lens, their strangeness deepens. The Great Pyramid may be a tomb, but it is also a story in stone, a story of alignment between earth and sky, of kingship linked to cosmic order. Stonehenge may have been a temple or a calendar, but it is also a myth enacted, a circle of stones where the sun itself became part of the ritual. The Nazca lines may have guided ceremonies or marked celestial patterns, but they are also vast drawings of story, laid across the land as if to speak to the sky. Each of these monuments is imagination made permanent, memory crystallized into matter. The danger is forgetting. When civilizations collapse, their stories are often lost, leaving only stone. Without the myth, the monument becomes a puzzle. We wander through ruins trying to guess their meaning, projecting our own imagination onto theirs. This is why myths matter so much. They are the carriers of meaning across collapse. When the Indus Valley fell, its script vanished, and with it the stories that once gave life to its cities. When the Maya declined, their glyphs were silenced, their calendars fragmented. What remains is stone without story, imagination without context. And yet, even in fragments, the stones whisper. They remind us that imagination is not just a product of progress, but a flame carried forward, fragile yet enduring. This flame is also visible in how civilizations viewed time. Many ancient cultures did not see time as linear, but cyclical. The Maya believed in great cycles of creation and destruction. The Hindus spoke of yugas, vast epochs in which humanity rises and falls. The Greeks told of ages that declined from gold to iron. Such views may reflect real memory of cycles of collapse, encoded into myth as cosmic law. If so, then imagination is not only about stories of gods, but about the structure of time itself. Civilization becomes an attempt to align human life with cosmic rhythm, to live not only in the present, but in awareness of cycles far larger than any one age. Modern science, too, has begun to see cycles where once it saw lines. Climate shifts, solar cycles, even geological events remind us that stability is the exception, not the rule. Civilizations rise and fall in part because the Earth itself breathes in rhythms we cannot control. Ancient people may have known this intuitively, encoding it in myth and aligning their lives with the stars. If so, their obsession with cycles was not primitive, but profound, a recognition that human story is woven into cosmic story. The question that remains is why imagination emerged when it did, why symbolic thought appeared so suddenly and so fully. Was it chance, necessity, or memory? Did humans discover imagination, or did they remember it? The sudden appearance of fully formed myths, calendars, and monuments suggests the latter. It suggests that imagination is not simply invention, but recollection, that the stories we tell may be echoes of something older, carried in our minds the way flood myths are carried in story. If this is true, then civilization itself is an act of remembering. Every temple, every story, every song is not only creation, but recovery, a reaching back to something once known. This may explain why myths so often speak of gifts from the sky, of gods who taught humanity. They may not describe literal beings, but the experience of remembering knowledge that felt as though it came from beyond. Imagination may be the bridge between past and present, between what was forgotten and what is remembered. And so, the mystery of civilization is not only about how we built monuments, but about how we learned to imagine. Without imagination, there is no myth, no ritual, no memory. With imagination, we become capable of building pyramids, aligning stones with stars, carving calendars into stone. Imagination is the fire at the heart of the cycle, the flame that survives collapse, carried in story when stone falls, carried in myth when memory fails. To explore it is to understand that our origins are not only material, but mental, not only physical, but symbolic. Civilization begins in the mind, in the sudden leap into imagination, in the remembering of stories older than we know. And that leap remains our greatest mystery, the true origin not only of history but of humanity itself. To follow the thread of imagination deeper is to notice how often it expresses itself through symbols carved into the earth and sky. The human mind has always had a hunger for signs, for patterns that link the visible world to the invisible. In this hunger lies the birth of writing, but writing did not begin as neutral record-keeping. It began as sacred mark-making, as an attempt to trap memory and bind it to matter. The earliest tablets of Sumer are not simple scribbles, but accounts of offerings to the gods and astronomical cycles. From the very start, writing was tied to the heavens and to ritual. The Egyptians painted hieroglyphs on tomb walls, not only to record history, but to ensure rebirth, believing words themselves held power. The Mayan glyphs were woven into their calendar, so that every inscription was not merely a story, but a map of time itself. What is strange is not that writing appeared, but that it appeared so fully formed, with complex systems of signs already in use. Where are the half-letters, the stumbling attempts to capture sound? They are missing, as though the knowledge of writing arrived as memory rather than invention. Symbols themselves suggest this memory. Across cultures, we find recurring images: the serpent, the sun, the spiral, the tree, the winged figure. These are archetypes, forms that seem to rise naturally in the human mind, but they also suggest a shared symbolic language older than any single culture. The serpent, for example, appears in Sumer as Ningishzida, in Egypt as the Uraeus serpent of protection, in Mesoamerica as Quetzalcoatl, in India as the Naga, in Norse myth as Jormungandr. Always the serpent is tied to wisdom, renewal, or cosmic cycles. How could such a symbol appear so consistently unless it was carried as memory across time and space? The same is true of the cosmic tree, the axis mundi that connects heaven and earth. From Yggdrasil in Norse myth, to the world tree in Maya cosmology, to the Asvatha tree in India, the symbol repeats, echoing the same vision of connection. Even numbers carry this memory. The number 7 appears again and again. 7 heavens, 7 days, 7 sages, 7 stars of the Pleiades. The number 12 recurs: 12 months, 12 constellations, 12 tribes, 12 Olympians. Such numerical patterns suggest more than coincidence. They reflect a symbolic order embedded in the fabric of culture, an order remembered across civilizations. Was it invented separately, or was it inherited, fragments of an older symbolic system carried forward after collapse? Architecture, too, becomes a language of symbols. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia were not simply temples, but cosmic mountains, stairways between heaven and earth. The pyramids of Egypt aligned with stars, anchoring the king's soul in the cosmos. The stelae of the Maya recorded not only dynasties, but cycles of time, their glyphs singing of beginnings and endings. The cathedrals of medieval Europe, with their rose windows and labyrinths, echo the same impulse: to embed cosmic memory in stone, to turn architecture into a book of symbols. In each case, the structure is both material and symbolic, both building and story. This is why ruins never feel silent. They hum with meaning, even when their language is lost. The persistence of symbols across cultures is one of the strongest hints that memory is deeper than history. Carl Jung spoke of the collective unconscious, archetypes that arise naturally from the structure of the human mind. But another possibility is that these archetypes are not only internal, but inherited, fragments of cultural memory carried across ages. If flood myths can survive 12,000 years, why not symbolic patterns? Perhaps the serpent, the tree, the star, and the cycle of 12 are all fragments of a symbolic language that predates the written record, remembered in different forms by different cultures. The stars themselves may have provided the framework. Constellations are natural symbols, patterns imposed upon the chaos of the sky. But the consistency is uncanny. Orion, for example, is recognized in cultures from Egypt to Greece to the Americas, often tied to hunting or rebirth. The Pleiades appear in myth from Japan to Australia to the Navajo, always as 7 sisters or maidens, always luminous and mysterious. These patterns suggest not just human imagination, but a shared symbolic heritage. Perhaps the first storytellers who looked at the sky named these stars, and their names traveled with migrating peoples, carried in story across continents. If so, then the sky itself is a memory palace, a vault of symbols that survived collapse because it was always above us, unchanged. If symbols are memory, then civilization is the act of embedding them in matter. Writing carves sound into clay. Architecture encodes myth in stone. Ritual enacts cosmic cycles in movement and chant. In this sense, civilization is less about invention than about inscription, writing memory into the world so that it survives forgetting. But the danger is that the symbols outlive their stories. A serpent on a temple wall may once have meant wisdom or renewal, but without the myth, it becomes decoration. A pyramid aligned with Orion may once have anchored a king's soul in the stars, but without the ritual, it becomes a tomb. The stones endure, but the meaning fades. This is why we wander among ruins, puzzled, piecing together fragments. The memory is there, but it is fractured, like shards of a broken tablet. The question that lingers is where the symbols first came from. Were they born in the human mind, inevitable expressions of imagination? Or were they remembered from an earlier age, carried across collapse? The suddenness with which complex writing, symbolic architecture, and cosmological systems appear suggests the latter. It suggests that civilization is not simply a product of progress, but a chain of memory, each age inheriting symbols from the one before. If so, then the serpent, the tree, the star, the cycle are not just metaphors but fragments of an older symbolic system, one that may stretch back to a forgotten civilization, or even further, to origins we cannot yet name. Symbols remind us that civilization is not only material, but spiritual, not only about survival, but about meaning. They show us that from the beginning, humanity has sought to connect the visible and the invisible, the earthly and the cosmic. And they suggest that our story is not only about what we build, but about what we remember. To study symbols is to read the memory of humanity, written not in history books, but in myths, ruins, and stars. And as we follow them across cultures, we begin to see that they are not many but one, a shared language that whispers of an origin older than any we know. Perhaps this is why we still respond so powerfully to symbols today. A cross, a circle, a spiral, a star. They stir something deep in us, something beyond culture, something older than history. They are echoes of memory, fragments of a forgotten language still alive in our imagination. To see them is to remember, even if we cannot name what we remember. And in that act of remembering lies the essence of civilization. Not invention, not progress, but the fragile and powerful attempt to hold on to meaning across the abyss of time. If symbols are the language of memory, then rituals are its music, the rhythm through which civilizations kept their stories alive. Long before printing presses or archives, memory was embodied in repetition. Chants, dances, festivals timed to the movement of the sun and moon. In ritual, myth became alive, and in myth, knowledge endured. To watch ancient cultures was to see people acting out their origins again and again, not simply telling stories, but reliving them. The Sumerians reenacted the sacred marriage of Inanna and Dumuzi each year, ensuring fertility of land and people. Egyptians celebrated the resurrection of Osiris with processions along the Nile, their songs and offerings turning myth into lived experience. The Maya timed their ceremonies with the cycles of Venus, believing the planet's rising and setting shaped the fates of kings and kingdoms. Ritual was not decoration. It was the engine of memory, the way fragments of knowledge survived when collapse erased everything else. The universality of ritual points to its importance. Even in cultures far apart, the same patterns appear: processions that mimic the sun's journey, sacrifices that symbolize renewal, dances that echo cosmic cycles. Why do these patterns repeat? Perhaps because they were practical, anchoring human life to agricultural rhythms, but perhaps also because they were fragments of something older, remembered in the body even when the mind forgot. Ritual is hard to erase. A song sung each year, a dance repeated for centuries, can carry memory far longer than writing. When the Indus Valley script was lost, rituals may have kept fragments alive. When Maya glyphs fell silent, their ceremonies continued in altered form. Even in modern times, holidays and festivals echo ancient patterns, their original meanings forgotten, but their rhythms intact. Consider the obsession with solstices and equinoxes. At Stonehenge, people gathered at dawn to watch the sun rise through standing stones, marking the longest and shortest days of the year. At Chichen Itza, shadows on the equinox turned the pyramid into a serpent descending. At Newgrange in Ireland, the winter solstice sun illuminated a burial chamber deep within the earth. Why this obsession with the turning points of the sun? Because they were not just astronomical events. They were symbols of death and rebirth, darkness and light, collapse and renewal. In these rhythms, people saw the echo of their own cycles, civilizations rising, falling, and rising again. To celebrate solstices was to enact not only the cosmic order, but the memory of survival, of light returning after darkness. Sacrifice, too, appears across cultures. In Mesoamerica, blood offerings were believed to sustain the cosmos, keeping the sun moving across the sky. In Greece, bulls were slaughtered in honor of the gods, their blood sanctifying temples. In India, the Vedic fire rituals offered clarified butter and grain to Agni, the fire god who carried them to heaven. Sacrifice may seem brutal to us, but to the ancients it was remembrance, the act of giving back what had once been given, of sustaining the cycle of gift and return. It symbolized the fragility of civilization, the recognition that life depends on forces beyond control. Even dance carries memory. Among the Hopi of North America, Kachina dances embody spirits of rain and fertility. In Africa, drum rhythms call ancestors into presence, linking the living with the dead. In Polynesia, hula encodes genealogies and cosmologies in movement, telling stories when words are not enough. To dance is to embody myth, to turn memory into motion. Such rituals survive collapses because they require no monuments, no writing, only bodies, voices, and time. They are portable memory systems, able to cross oceans and centuries intact. What is striking is how many rituals across the world encode the same cosmological ideas. The union of male and female, symbolized in sacred marriages, appears in Sumer, Egypt, India, and beyond. The cycle of death and resurrection is universal, whether in Osiris, Persephone, or the maize god of the Maya. The descent into darkness and return to light is acted out in solstice festivals from Europe to the Andes. These repeating patterns suggest not random invention, but inheritance. Fragments of a ritual system older than any one culture, carried forward through collapse as embodied memory. Ritual also reveals how ancient people saw themselves in relation to the cosmos. They did not imagine themselves as separate from the natural world, but as participants in its cycles. By aligning rituals with stars and seasons, they placed themselves within a cosmic order. Civilization, in this sense, was not just about cities and laws, but about harmony with the rhythms of the universe. The danger, of course, was forgetting. When rituals lost their meaning, when collapse severed memory, the cosmic order seemed broken, and civilizations faltered. We can see this even in our time. Modern societies have their rituals, national holidays, religious ceremonies, even sporting events that serve as collective memory. They tell stories of origins, victories, and values. They are not so different from solstice festivals or sacred dances. The difference is that we often forget their deeper roots, seeing them as entertainment rather than survival. Yet the human hunger for ritual remains. It is as if our species cannot exist without rhythm, without shared action that binds us to one another and to the cosmos. If rituals are fragments of memory, then they may also be keys. They may carry echoes of lost knowledge, encoded in symbols and actions. A dance that mimics the path of the sun may be more than metaphor. It may preserve astronomical observations in embodied form. A chant repeated for centuries may contain fragments of a lost language. A festival tied to a constellation may recall migrations or catastrophes long forgotten. In this way, rituals are living ruins, monuments not of stone, but of rhythm. They remind us that memory is not only written or carved, but sung, danced, enacted. Perhaps this is why rituals feel so powerful, even when their original meaning is lost. To stand in a circle of dancers, to watch the sun rise through an ancient temple, to hear a chant repeated in a language you do not understand. These experiences stir something deep, something beyond intellect. They awaken memory that is older than history, memory carried in the body, memory of cycles larger than any individual life. This is why rituals endure. They are not fragile like books or monuments. They are resilient, carried in the pulse of the human body, repeated until they become part of us. And so, in the great story of civilization, rituals are as important as pyramids or myths. They are the glue that held societies together, the vessel that carried memory across collapse. They are why we still remember flood myths, why we still align with solstices, why we still see ourselves in cycles of death and rebirth. To study rituals is to glimpse the continuity beneath the fractures, to see how memory survived when everything else was lost. Civilization, then, is not only in the stones of ruins, but in the movements of bodies, the rhythms of chants, the cycles of festivals. It is in the fire lit at midwinter, in the blood spilled on altars, in the dance that echoes stars. These are the living threads that bind us to our ancestors, to their myths, to their collapses and recoveries. They remind us that memory is not only intellectual but embodied, not only fragile but resilient. And they whisper that as long as we keep dancing, chanting, celebrating, we will carry fragments of the past into the future, even if the rest is forgotten. If rituals carried memory through the body, then stories carried it through the tongue. Oral tradition is one of the oldest technologies of civilization, long before writing carved symbols into stone or pressed ink into parchment. In the cadence of spoken word, knowledge was passed from elder to child, from priest to initiate, from traveler to host. These traditions did not merely entertain. They encoded survival, cosmology, law, and history. To lose the story was to lose identity, and so cultures developed elaborate methods to ensure memory endured. Epic poems stretched for thousands of lines, repeated until they became ingrained. Genealogies were recited back for centuries, stitching the present to the past. Proverbs and parables compressed wisdom into short, memorable forms. The voice became the archive, and the human ear the library. Examples of this endurance are staggering. The Iliad and Odyssey, attributed to Homer, survived orally for centuries before they were written down, their rhythm and rhyme designed to anchor memory. In India, the Rig Veda, one of the world's oldest sacred texts, was transmitted orally for perhaps 2 millennia with astonishing accuracy, its verses preserved by complex recitation methods that involved repeating in multiple patterns. Aboriginal Australians carry stories in songlines, paths across the landscape, where each landmark is tied to a verse, creating a living map that guides travelers across vast deserts. In North America, the Haudenosaunee remember the great law of peace through oral tradition, their constitution encoded in wampum belts and repeated in councils. These are not primitive methods, but highly sophisticated memory systems, designed to outlast collapse, fire, and forgetting. What makes oral traditions particularly fascinating is their ability to preserve fragments of deep time. Geologists have begun comparing indigenous stories with physical evidence, and the results are startling. Aboriginal tales describe coastlines swallowed by the sea, events that align with the rising waters of the end of the Ice Age, more than 10,000 years ago. Stories from Native American tribes in the Pacific Northwest describe volcanic eruptions and floods that align with geological evidence of Mount Mazama's explosion, which formed Crater Lake nearly 8 millennia ago. These accounts are not vague legends. They are memories carried across hundreds of generations. They suggest that oral tradition can preserve history far longer than we once believed, albeit in symbolic form. If this is true, then myths of floods, star people, and golden ages may also preserve memories of real events or lost civilizations. A flood myth may encode the trauma of rising seas. A tale of gods descending from the sky may echo the arrival of strangers with unfamiliar knowledge. A story of a lost golden age may preserve the memory of a collapsed world before ours. Oral tradition is not literal history, but it is not fantasy either. It is memory transformed into narrative, metaphor, and symbol. To dismiss it is to throw away one of the richest archives humanity possesses. The beauty of oral tradition is that it evolves even as it preserves. A story told by one generation may shift slightly in the next, adapting to new circumstances, embedding new meanings. This adaptability ensures survival. Written texts may be destroyed, but oral stories live in the bodies of people, reshaping themselves as needed. Yet within the changes, the core often remains. Flood myths across the world differ in details but share the same structure: destruction, survival, renewal. Star myths vary in names but preserve the same constellations. These patterns suggest a continuity of memory, stretching back further than written history, linking us to ancestors we no longer recognize. What is striking is how often oral traditions preserve technical or scientific knowledge disguised as story. Polynesian navigators remembered star maps in chants, reciting the order of rising and setting stars to guide voyages across the Pacific. In India, astronomical cycles were embedded in myth, so that even if mathematical formulas were forgotten, the story preserved the pattern. In Africa, agricultural knowledge was preserved in proverbs, linking planting and harvest to the movement of stars or the behavior of animals. Oral tradition allowed knowledge to be encoded in forms resistant to time, carried in rhythm, rhyme, and image. It is no coincidence that so many ancient myths are poetic. Poetry is easier to remember than prose, and so it becomes the vessel of memory. The fragility of oral tradition, of course, is that it depends on continuity of people. A collapse, a plague, or a conquest can sever the chain. When elders are killed or displaced, when languages are silenced, stories vanish. Colonization, for example, destroyed countless oral traditions, erasing not only memory but identity. Yet fragments survive. Even when languages die, some stories echo in hybrid forms, preserved in folklore, rituals, or syncretic religions. The resilience of oral tradition is remarkable. It bends, adapts, and continues even when crushed. If oral traditions preserve memory of floods and catastrophes, then we must ask what else they might contain. Could they hold traces of lost civilizations, remembered not as fact, but as myth? Plato's story of Atlantis may be one such fragment, carried through oral channels until he recorded it. The tales of star people may preserve memories of ancient migrations guided by celestial navigation. The myths of giants may recall encounters with megafauna long extinct. To explore oral traditions is to open a door into a deeper past, one that stretches beyond the boundaries of archaeology. Modern science has only begun to appreciate this. Where once myths were dismissed as fantasy, researchers now look for correlations with natural events, migrations, and climate change. The more we study, the more we realize that oral traditions may contain memories 10,000 years old or more. This forces us to reconsider our sense of history. Civilization may not be as young as we think, because memory stretches further than ruins. Oral traditions remind us that even when stone crumbles and writing vanishes, memory can endure in story, passed mouth to ear for centuries. The lesson is humbling. We live in an age of digital archives, yet our memory is fragile. Servers can crash, formats can become obsolete, data can vanish in an instant. Oral traditions remind us that the human body itself is the oldest archive, the voice the most enduring medium. They whisper that memory is not only about technology, but about culture, about the willingness to tell and retell, to listen and remember. Civilization, then, is not only in cities, monuments, and writing, but in the breath of storytellers. It lives in the myths of floods, in chants of stars, in proverbs of planting, in epics of gods and heroes. To sit by a fire and listen to an elder speak is to connect with a chain stretching back into the deep past, a chain unbroken despite collapse after collapse. Oral tradition is civilization itself, fragile yet resilient, ever-changing yet enduring, carrying the memory of who we are and where we came from. In those stories, we glimpse not only history, but prehistory, not only the past, but echoes of worlds long forgotten. When we think of civilization, we often picture monuments rising from stone or scrolls filled with text. But another form of memory exists, one that is both invisible and enduring. Language. To speak is to inherit the voices of countless ancestors, to carry forward a lineage not of blood, but of sound. Every word is a fossil, every sentence a living ruin, and in the grammar of tongues we can glimpse the migrations, exchanges, and collapses that shaped humanity. Linguists have discovered that languages can preserve memories just as myths do, encoding ancient contact and forgotten origins in their structures. To study them is to map the flow of civilizations, to see how knowledge traveled and survived. The Indo-European family is a striking example. From Sanskrit in India to Greek, Latin, and English, its languages cover half the globe. They preserve shared roots that hint at a common origin, a people whose words scattered like seeds across continents. Embedded in those words are fragments of their world, terms for snow and horse, wheel and kinship, that reveal their environment and technology before written history. This is not archaeology of stone, but of sound, a reconstruction of a culture that left no monuments, but whose voice still shapes ours. If myths preserve memory through story, languages preserve it through structure, carrying fragments of the past invisibly in daily speech. Other families tell similar stories. Austronesian languages, spread across islands from Madagascar to Hawaii, testify to one of the greatest migrations in human history. Navigators carried not only canoes and stars, but words, planting them across the ocean. Today, linguists can trace their path through shared terms for canoe parts, stars, and food. Here again, language becomes a map of civilization's spread, a reminder that culture is not confined to land, but can cross seas, carried in memory and voice. In Africa, the Bantu languages reveal a vast expansion southward, their vocabulary marking the spread of agriculture and ironworking. These linguistic trails are not just abstract. They show us how fragments of civilization moved, survived, and transformed. What makes language especially powerful is its resilience. Empires can fall, cities can burn, but words often survive. Latin died as a spoken tongue, yet its fragments live in Italian, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. Sanskrit ceased to be everyday speech, but its structure persists in Hindi and other tongues. Old English transformed into modern English, yet ancient words like mother and fire carry echoes of ancestors who spoke millennia ago. Language adapts, evolves, and carries memory across collapse. Even when conquerors impose new tongues, old ones survive in place names, proverbs, and accents. The land itself speaks through language, preserving traces of forgotten peoples. Yet language, like myth, can also vanish. Colonialism silenced countless indigenous tongues, severing chains of memory that had lasted thousands of years. With each lost language, we lose not only words, but worldviews, unique ways of seeing, naming, and relating to reality. A word is never just a sound. It is a crystallization of experience. The Inuit have multiple terms for snow, each reflecting survival in a frozen world. Desert peoples name winds with precision, reflecting their intimate knowledge of sand and heat. To lose a language is to lose a memory of the earth itself, a fragment of civilization erased. Some languages preserve startling memories of ancient contact. In the South Pacific, Polynesian words echo terms from South America, suggesting that voyagers crossed oceans long before European explorers. In Siberia and North America, linguistic parallels suggest deep connections across the Bering Land Bridge. In West Africa, words tied to metallurgy reveal knowledge systems older than archaeology alone can confirm. These fragments remind us that civilizations were never isolated. They spoke, traded, and remembered across vast distances, and language carries the traces of those forgotten conversations. There is also the strange persistence of sacred languages. Hebrew, Sanskrit, Latin, and classical Arabic survive not as everyday speech, but as vessels of ritual, preserved by religions that guard their memory. To chant in Sanskrit is to echo voices thousands of years old. To read Latin prayers is to connect with Rome's shadow. These sacred tongues remind us that memory can be preserved deliberately, frozen in ritual to resist the erosion of time. They are time capsules of sound, carrying forward the imagination of entire civilizations. The mystery deepens when we notice similarities across distant tongues. The word for mother, ma, ama, mama, appears in dozens of unrelated languages. Father, pa, papa, abba, does the same. Some argue this is coincidence, the natural sounds of babies forming words. Others suggest it reflects a deeper unity, a common root stretching back into prehistory. If true, then the words we speak today may be among the oldest artifacts we possess, fossils of sound older than any pyramid or temple. They are the hidden monuments of civilization, carved not in stone, but in breath. What emerges from the study of language is the same pattern we see in myths and ruins: sudden appearance, wide distribution, cycles of loss and survival. Writing systems, too, show this. Cuneiform, hieroglyphs, Indus script, Mayan glyphs, they appear already complex, as if inherited. Alphabetic systems arise later but spread rapidly, reshaping memory itself by making it portable and durable. Yet even writing depends on speech, and speech depends on memory. Civilization may build with stone and metal, but its deepest foundation is the word. Language also reveals how civilizations viewed time and self. Some tongues place the past behind and the future ahead, while others reverse the metaphor. Some have no tense at all, framing time as cyclical. Some lack a word for I, embedding the self within community. These differences shape thought, culture, and even the ability to imagine. They remind us that civilization is not only about material achievement, but about the inner architecture of the mind. The way we speak shapes the way we see, and the way we see shapes the way we build. To lose a language, then, is to lose a way of being human. Yet even in loss, fragments survive. Place names, loanwords, accents, they whisper of forgotten worlds. The Mississippi River carries an Algonquian name, the Thames an ancient Celtic one. These are linguistic ruins, just as real as stone. They remind us that civilization leaves traces not only in monuments, but in syllables, echoes of memory carried on the tongue. Perhaps this is why myths so often describe gods as speaking worlds into being. In Genesis, God says, "Let there be light," and there is light. In the Rig Veda, the universe is born from sound, the primordial Om. In Egyptian myth, Ta creates the world through speech. These stories recognize what we too often forget. Words are creative forces, carriers of memory, builders of worlds. Civilization is not possible without them, because civilization is itself a conversation stretched across centuries. To listen closely to language is to hear the hum of forgotten civilizations. Every word we speak is a survivor, a fragment carried through collapse, conquest, and change. Together they form a chorus of memory, older than stone, more enduring than empire. Civilization may rise and fall, but as long as words are spoken, memory survives. To honor language is to honor civilization itself, to recognize that the true ruins are not only in deserts or jungles, but in the syllables we carry in our mouths, echoes of ancestors reminding us who we are. To trace the hidden threads of civilization, we must look not only at myths, rituals, and languages, but also at the sciences hidden within them. For too long, modern minds have assumed that ancient people were ignorant, bound to superstition, until the enlightenment of recent centuries. Yet when we look closer, we find mathematics, astronomy, and engineering embedded in monuments and myths, suggesting knowledge far more advanced than we expect. It is not only the grandeur of pyramids or temples that astonishes, but the precision of numbers carved into their design. The Great Pyramid at Giza, for example, encodes ratios that approximate pi and the golden ratio, constants we associate with modern mathematics. Its alignment to true north is off by only a fraction of a degree, more accurate than many modern structures. Was this coincidence or deliberate knowledge preserved from a forgotten age? In Mesopotamia, clay tablets show complex mathematics, including quadratic equations and sophisticated accounting systems. The Babylonians tracked planetary cycles with accuracy rivaling Renaissance astronomers, predicting eclipses centuries in advance. Their sexagesimal base 60 number system, still preserved in our division of time into 60 minutes and 360 degrees of a circle, suggests not only invention, but inheritance. Why base 60 unless it was rooted in a system older than theirs, perhaps tied to astronomical cycles long observed? In the Indus Valley, standardized weights and measures reflect not only bureaucracy, but an underlying mathematical worldview. Across the ocean, the Maya developed a base 20 system and conceived of zero independently, using it in their calendar centuries before Europeans adopted it. Such sophistication appears suddenly, with no clear trail of gradual development. Astronomy shows the same mystery. Ancient cultures tracked Venus, Jupiter, and the Moon with uncanny precision. The Maya knew the exact length of the solar year, accurate to within seconds. The Babylonians recorded the Saros cycle, predicting eclipses with ease. Stonehenge, beyond being a ritual site, also served as an astronomical observatory, its stones marking solstices and lunar standstills. At Nabta Playa in the Nubian desert, stone circles older than Stonehenge align with Sirius and Orion, suggesting sky-watching practices thousands of years earlier than expected. To the Polynesians, the sky was a map, its stars guiding them across the Pacific in journeys that rival modern navigation. This is not primitive curiosity. It is science, memory encoded in observation, preserved across generations with astonishing fidelity. The question is how such knowledge appeared so suddenly. The standard explanation is patience, generations of observation leading to cumulative accuracy. Yet the sudden leaps are hard to ignore. How did the Maya devise a calendar that tracked cycles longer than their own history? How did Egyptians build structures aligned to celestial bodies with such precision when their tools were supposedly simple? How did Dogon mythology describe Sirius as a binary star, a fact modern telescopes only confirmed in the 19th century? Skeptics dismiss such claims as coincidence or misinterpretation, but the pattern remains. Advanced knowledge appears abruptly, often encoded in myth or architecture, as though remembered rather than discovered. Engineering deepens the puzzle. The stone blocks of Baalbek, weighing over 1,000 tons, lie beyond the capacity of most modern cranes. At Pumapunku, stones of hard andesite are cut with interlocking precision, resembling prefabricated components. In Egypt, the unfinished obelisk in Aswan shows the ambition of carving and moving single stones of hundreds of tons. Easter Island's Moai, weighing more than 80 tons, were transported miles across uneven terrain. Conventional explanations invoke ramps, ropes, and labor, and human ingenuity should never be underestimated. But the consistency of monumental precision across cultures suggests something more, a shared inheritance of techniques now forgotten. Even myths themselves encode scientific knowledge. In India, the Vedas describe cycles of time, kalpas and yugas, spanning billions of years, eerily close to modern cosmological scales. In Greece, Pythagoras taught that numbers underlie reality, a teaching that resonates with modern physics. In Mesopotamia, the movements of gods often mirrored planetary motions, embedding astronomy in theology. These are not primitive guesses, but sophisticated symbolic systems where myth and science intertwine. Perhaps what we call mythology was, in part, a memory system for scientific knowledge, encoded in story so it could survive collapse. Take the myth of Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica. He is often linked with Venus, the morning star, whose cycles were meticulously tracked by the Maya and Aztecs. His disappearance and promised return may symbolize Venus's cycle of disappearance and reappearance. In Egypt, Osiris's death and resurrection align with Orion and Sirius, whose rising marked the Nile flood. In Mesopotamia, Inanna's descent into the underworld parallels Venus's descent below the horizon. These myths are not only spiritual, they are astronomical codes, embedding precise knowledge of celestial cycles into narrative. If myths encode science, then science itself may be far older than we think. Perhaps the reason civilizations appear suddenly with advanced astronomy, mathematics, and engineering is because they inherited fragments of knowledge from an earlier age. If a civilization existed before the floods at the end of the Ice Age, its survivors may have carried fragments forward, preserving them in myth and ritual until they could be expressed again in stone and number. This would explain why the Great Pyramid encodes constants, why calendars appear complete, why star alignments repeat across continents. Civilization may not have invented science anew, but remembered it imperfectly. The fragility of this memory is evident in collapse. When civilizations fall, knowledge often vanishes. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a shipwreck off Greece, was a complex mechanical computer capable of predicting planetary motions. Its existence was forgotten for 2,000 years, and no other device like it survived. Roman concrete, more durable than ours, was lost for centuries after the empire fell. Techniques for moving massive stones were forgotten, leaving us puzzled by the monuments that remain. These examples show that advanced knowledge can vanish quickly, leaving behind only fragments. If this happened in recent history, how much more could have been lost in deeper prehistory? What emerges is a humbling recognition. Science is not a straight line of progress, but a cycle of remembering and forgetting. We rediscover, we refine, we lose, and we rediscover again. Our ancestors may not have been primitive, but guardians of fragments, carriers of knowledge across collapses. Their myths, monuments, and mathematics may not be beginnings but survivals, the last echoes of an earlier world. If so, then modern science is not the first awakening of reason, but the latest, built on forgotten foundations we barely recognize. This perspective reshapes our understanding of civilization. It is not only about survival or social order, but about memory. Memory of numbers, stars, and techniques that reach beyond the lifespan of any one culture. The stones of pyramids, the cycles of calendars, the chants of rituals all serve the same purpose: to carry knowledge across collapse, to anchor memory against forgetting. In this sense, ancient science was not separate from myth, but part of it, wrapped in story to ensure survival. We may be rediscovering now what was already known, piecing together fragments once whole. To walk among ruins is to feel the weight of this forgotten science. It is not only stone that endures, but number, alignment, and pattern. The monuments are not only tombs or temples, but textbooks in stone, preserving ratios, cycles, and techniques. To study them is to listen to the hum of ancient science, to hear memory speaking through silence. Civilization, then, is not only the story of invention, but of recollection, not only progress, but return. And perhaps the greatest mystery is not what our ancestors knew, but what we have forgotten. If ancient science is a kind of memory, then perhaps the most haunting question is where that memory originated. For centuries, people have speculated about a lost mother culture, an civilization from which fragments of knowledge spread after catastrophe. Atlantis, as described by Plato, is the most famous example, but it is hardly the only one. Cultures across the world preserve myths of sunken lands, drowned islands, or vanished kingdoms. The Greeks told of Hyperborea, a land of eternal spring at the edge of the world. The Celts spoke of Tir na Nog, an island beyond the sea where time flowed differently. In India, the Mahabharata describes Dvaraka, a city of great splendor swallowed by the ocean. In Southeast Asia, legends tell of Kumari Kandam, a lost continent south of India. Even in the Pacific, stories of Lemuria or Mu echo across islands. These are not identical tales, yet they all share the same rhythm. A place of knowledge and power destroyed in catastrophe, its survivors scattered, carrying fragments of memory. Modern archaeology has not uncovered a definitive Atlantis, but the possibility of lost coastal civilizations is very real. At the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, sea levels rose by more than 100 meters, drowning vast coastlines where early people likely lived. Today, most of humanity resides near coasts. Why would it have been different then? If advanced societies flourished along those now submerged shores, their ruins would be hidden beneath waves and sediment, beyond the easy reach of archaeology. Only fragments inland, monuments, myths, rituals would survive, leaving us with puzzles that seem to appear suddenly without precedent. The evidence is circumstantial but suggestive. Off the coast of Japan, at Yonaguni, divers discovered massive stone structures with steps, terraces, and pillars. Some argue they are natural formations, but their sharp angles and deliberate shapes suggest human modification. In India's Gulf of Khambat, sonar surveys revealed structures beneath the sea, later confirmed as ancient settlements dating back 9,000 years, far older than the Indus Valley. Off Cuba, deep beneath the Caribbean, sonar images show geometric patterns that resemble roads or plazas. None of these are definitive proof of a lost civilization, but together they raise the possibility that much of our story lies underwater, erased by the rising seas. Even on land, there are hints of forgotten ages. Göbekli Tepe, with its 12,000-year-old megaliths, predates agriculture and challenges our assumptions about the sequence of civilization. If hunter-gatherers built it, then they were capable of far more organization and vision than we believed. Or perhaps they were the descendants of a lost culture, carrying fragments of memory into a new world. Similarly, the discovery of ancient maps, like the Piri Reis map of 1513, which seems to depict parts of Antarctica's coastline without ice, raises questions about knowledge inherited from earlier sources. How could Renaissance cartographers know what modern explorers only confirmed centuries later, unless they drew on charts from civilizations long gone? The idea of a lost mother culture is controversial because it challenges the narrative of linear progress. But the fragments, flood myths, submerged ruins, sudden monuments, fit together too neatly to dismiss. What if civilization is not an invention of one place and time, but the survival of an earlier flame, scattered and rekindled after disaster? This would explain why pyramids rise in both Egypt and Mesoamerica, why astronomy appears fully formed across continents, why myths of gods as teachers repeat worldwide. It would also explain the sudden leaps in agriculture and writing, as if people were not starting from nothing but remembering, rebuilding from fragments. The possibility of a lost civilization is not merely romantic speculation. It forces us to reconsider what it means to be human. If others came before us, as advanced or more advanced than we are now, then our story is not unique. We are not the first, but part of a cycle, inheritors of forgotten ages. This is humbling because it reminds us of fragility. No matter how advanced civilizations can fall, leaving only ruins and myths, it also inspires wonder because it means the past may hold greater mysteries than we dream. To find a sunken city beneath the waves would not only rewrite history, but reconnect us with forgotten kin, voices that once spoke in languages now lost, builders whose knowledge shaped the world we inherited. Skeptics argue that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and they are right. But evidence can be destroyed, hidden, or forgotten. The sea is the greatest eraser, and time is merciless. The fact that fragments survive at all is remarkable. Myths of floods, ruins like Göbekli Tepe, anomalous artifacts like the Antikythera mechanism, they are whispers, not shouts, but together they suggest that memory stretches deeper than we admit. Science itself is beginning to explore this. Underwater archaeology is still young, limited by technology, but as it advances, we may uncover more. What we find may confirm that humanity's story is far older and richer than we believed. Even if no single Atlantis existed, the idea of a lost mother culture has value. It is a symbol of memory itself, of the cycles of rise and fall, of the fragility of knowledge. It reminds us that civilizations can vanish without trace, leaving only echoes. It also challenges our arrogance. We believe ourselves to be the pinnacle of progress, but the ruins whisper otherwise. They tell us that others may have stood where we stand, gazed at the same stars, built monuments we now puzzle over, and then disappeared. If it happened before, it can happen again. To imagine a lost civilization is to imagine ourselves in its place. What fragments of our world would survive if we fell? Skyscrapers would crumble, metal would rust, paper would rot. Digital memory, so vast today, could vanish with the flicker of a grid. 1,000 years later, what would remain? Perhaps only fragments of concrete, mysterious circuits, myths of a golden age of flying machines and glowing screens. To future generations, We might look like gods who fell, remembered in story but misunderstood. In this sense, Atlantis is not only about the past, it is about the present and the future. The ruins we do know remind us of this fragility. Baalbek, Pumapunku, the Great Pyramid, each stands as a puzzle, but also as a warning. Civilization is fragile. Knowledge is fragile. Memory is fragile. If we are part of a cycle, then our challenge is not only to build, but to preserve, to ensure that the torch of knowledge is carried forward even if collapse comes. Perhaps that is what the myths are truly about. Not gods or aliens, but memory itself, warning us not to forget, reminding us that we are not the first and may not be the last. To seek Atlantis, then, is not only to hunt for ruins beneath the sea. It is to listen to the silence of history, to recognize the gaps and wonder what lies within them. It is to admit that we do not know as much as we think, that the past is larger, stranger, and more mysterious than our textbooks suggest. And it is to realize that our story is not finished. We are part of the same cycle, building, rising, perhaps one day falling, leaving fragments for others to puzzle over. The lost civilization we seek may not only be behind us, it may also be ahead. If the search for a lost mother culture pulls us into the ocean depths, then another strand of mystery pulls us upward into the stars. For as long as humans have looked to the night sky, we have wondered not only at its beauty, but at its meaning. Myths speak of gods descending from the heavens, of teachers arriving from the stars, of ancestors who came from constellations and promised to return. In modern times, such stories have been recast in the language of extraterrestrials, but their roots are ancient. Across continents, separated by oceans, we find the same pattern, the idea that knowledge came from above. The Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. Egyptians linked Osiris and Isis to Orion and Sirius, their myths tied to celestial cycles. The Maya connected Quetzalcoatl to Venus, tracking its rising and setting with uncanny precision. The Dogon of Mali told of beings from Sirius, long before telescopes confirmed its binary nature. Polynesians sang of star ancestors who guided them across oceans. To dismiss all this as coincidence is tempting, but the repetition is striking. What did ancient people mean when they said their teachers came from the stars? The most cautious interpretation is symbolic. Stars were guides, and so to say that knowledge came from the stars may simply mean it was profound, eternal, beyond ordinary human reach. Another interpretation is migration, that strangers arrived from distant lands, carrying technologies and myths, and were remembered as celestial beings. But there remains the possibility, unsettling yet persistent, that these stories echo something more literal. Contact with intelligences beyond our world. The monuments intensify this mystery. Why do so many align with Orion, Sirius, and the Pleiades? The Great Pyramid's shafts point to Orion's belt and Sirius. Teotihuacan's layout echoes the stars of Orion. The Pleiades are celebrated in myths from Greece to Japan to the Americas, always as 7 sisters or maidens. Why such global fixation on specific stars? Were they symbolic, or were they remembered as points of origin, markers of journeys, or signals from the sky? If civilization is memory, then perhaps these alignments are more than architecture. They are maps, reminders of a connection to the stars, preserved in stone. Even in myth, the pattern of descent and departure repeats. Teachers arrive, bring knowledge, and then leave, promising to return. Quetzalcoatl departs across the sea, saying he will one day come back. Osiris dies and is resurrected, linked eternally to Orion's cycle. The Anunnaki descend, teach, and vanish. This pattern suggests discontinuity. Knowledge appears, flourishes, and then disappears, leaving people to carry fragments forward. Whether those teachers were divine, human, or something else, the rhythm remains. Arrival, gift, departure, memory. Modern readers are quick to project extraterrestrial interpretations onto these stories. The 20th century, with its rockets and satellites, made the idea of alien contact plausible in a way it was not before. Books and documentaries have reimagined gods as astronauts, myths as misunderstood encounters with technology. The image of shining beings descending from the sky resonates strongly because we now know such travel is possible. But whether or not ancient people met extraterrestrials, their myths still preserve something deeper. The sense that knowledge is not merely human invention, but a gift, a connection to something beyond ourselves. Skeptics argue that we see aliens in myths only because of our modern imagination, but the persistence of star-linked myths across cultures suggests more than projection. Why did the Dogon focus on Sirius? Why did Egyptians, Mayans, and Sumerians all tie their origins to Orion and Venus? Why do Polynesian navigators still sing of star ancestors? Even if these are not literal, they preserve memory of a cosmic connection, one that shaped how civilizations saw themselves. It is worth asking why humans, at the dawn of civilization, were so obsessed with the stars. Practical needs, navigation, calendars, agriculture, explain part of it, but the intensity of their devotion suggests something more. They built temples, pyramids, and stone circles aligned not only with solstices, but with constellations. They embedded star myths in their identities, seeing themselves as children of the heavens. Perhaps this was simply reverence, or perhaps it was remembrance, echoes of encounters, migrations, or teachings tied to the sky. Even today, the stars still pull us. Our modern myths, science fiction stories of interstellar travel, alien contact, cosmic civilizations, are not so different from the old ones. They express the same hunger, the same suspicion that we are not alone, that our story is part of a larger cosmic drama. The old myths and the new merge, suggesting that the longing itself is part of humanity, a memory written not only in culture, but in consciousness. If the myths are true, whether literally or symbolically, then civilization is not confined to Earth. It is part of a larger story, one that stretches into the cosmos. Our ancestors may have remembered fragments of this story, encoding it in myth and monument, aligning their lives with the stars. We, too, continue this pattern, building telescopes, launching probes, searching the skies for signals. In doing so, we are not inventing curiosity, but continuing a memory older than history. The challenge is interpretation. If myths of star teachers are symbolic, they remind us that knowledge always feels like a gift, a descent of light into darkness. If they are historical, they suggest that contact, whether with distant humans or others, shaped our beginnings. If they are literal, they imply that we are part of a cosmic community, one we have forgotten but may remember again. Each interpretation changes how we see ourselves. Perhaps the truth is all three. Myths are symbolic, historical, and literal at once. They preserve memory in multiple layers, ensuring survival even if one layer is lost. A story of gods from Orion may symbolize cycles of life, record the arrival of a migrating people, and echo an encounter with something beyond Earth, all at once. To reduce myths to one explanation is to flatten their richness. To honor them is to accept their multiplicity, their ability to carry memory across collapse in symbolic, historical, and literal forms. In the end, whether or not beings came from the stars, the myths tell us something essential. Humanity has always felt connected to the cosmos. We have always seen ourselves as more than terrestrial, as participants in a larger story. Civilization is not only about cities and laws, but about this cosmic imagination, this hunger to link our lives to the heavens. That hunger is itself a form of memory, a whisper that we are part of something greater, a reminder that the stars are not only above us but within us. To look at the myths of star teachers is to look at a mirror. They show us our longing, our suspicion that knowledge is gift, our fragility in the face of forgetting. They also show us our resilience, our ability to carry memory across millennia, to encode cosmic connection in stone and story. Whether literal or metaphor, they remind us that civilization has always been a dialogue between earth and sky. And as we step into space with rockets and satellites, we are not breaking new ground, but retracing an old path, remembering in our own way that our story has always belonged to the stars. The mystery of civilization grows sharper when we shift from myths of gods and stars to the ground beneath our feet. For the earth itself holds memory, written not in symbols or language, but in layers of stone, ice, and soil. Geologists and archaeologists read these layers like pages of a book, each stratum recording a fragment of history. Yet sometimes the pages do not match the story we expect. Sometimes we find anomalies, artifacts too old, ruins too advanced, fossils where they should not be. These anomalies do not fit neatly into the narrative of linear progress. They are disruptions, whispers of forgotten ages, hints that the story of humanity is deeper and stranger than we imagine. One such disruption lies at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. Radiocarbon dating places it at more than 11,000 years old, far earlier than agriculture or cities were thought to exist. Its massive pillars, carved with animals and symbols, form circles that resemble temples. To build such structures required planning, organization, and shared myth, qualities we do not associate with hunter-gatherers. And yet there it stands, buried deliberately as though its builders sought to preserve it for a future age. Was Göbekli Tepe the last echo of a lost civilization? A fragment of memory surviving the floods of the Ice Age? Or was it the beginning of a new one, a sudden leap sparked by knowledge carried forward? Other sites raise similar questions. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, andesite blocks cut with machine-like precision lie scattered across a plateau. Mainstream archaeology dates them to around 500 CE, but the techniques implied seem beyond the tools of the time. In Lebanon, Baalbek's foundation stones weigh over 1,000 tons, too massive for modern cranes to move easily. In India, underwater ruins in the Gulf of Kambat suggest settlements 9,000 years old. These anomalies may have conventional explanations, but collectively, they challenge the neat story of gradual progress. They feel like fragments of something older, carried into younger hands that could not sustain them. Artifacts also disrupt the narrative. The Antikythera mechanism, a corroded device from a Greek shipwreck, turned out to be a sophisticated astronomical computer capable of predicting eclipses and planetary motions. Nothing like it survived until modern times, and its sudden appearance suggests forgotten traditions of engineering. Roman concrete, more durable than ours, was lost for centuries. Damascus steel, famed for its strength and beauty, disappeared with its secrets. These examples show that knowledge can be lost, and if it can be lost in the recent past, how much more might have vanished in prehistory? Perhaps what we see as anomalies are not miracles, but survivals, fragments of forgotten sciences resurfacing briefly before vanishing again. Even fossils and geological layers preserve anomalies. In some mines and strata, tools or imprints appear in layers far older than human history allows. Most are dismissed as misinterpretations or mistakes, but they fuel speculation that civilization may stretch deeper into time than we think. While many such claims remain controversial, they remind us of how little we truly know. The Earth is vast, its history deep, and our exploration of it still limited. If traces of lost civilizations exist, they may lie buried beyond our reach, waiting to be uncovered or eroded into view. Natural disasters amplify this mystery. Around 12,800 years ago, at the end of the Ice Age, the Younger Dryas event brought sudden cooling and chaos. Some scientists suggest it was triggered by comet fragments striking the Earth, causing widespread fires and floods. If civilizations existed then, they would have been devastated. Sea levels rose more than 100 meters, drowning coastal settlements. Rivers shifted, climates changed, megafauna vanished. In such upheaval, how much memory would survive? Myths of floods and fire echo this trauma. The Bible's Noah, Mesopotamia's Utnapishtim, India's Manu, and countless indigenous stories preserve the memory of destruction. If we take them seriously, they may be cultural records of real global catastrophe, remembered for millennia. What is striking is how often anomalies align with myths. Myths speak of gods who taught knowledge, of floods that destroyed worlds, of lost golden ages. Anomalous sites and artifacts suggest sudden leaps of knowledge, sudden collapses, sudden disappearances. Together they hint at a cycle: rise, brilliance, collapse, survival, forgetting. We may not need to imagine a single lost Atlantis, but many forgotten ages, each leaving fragments for the next. Civilization becomes less a straight line and more a palimpsest, each layer written over the last, fragments bleeding through. Skeptics argue that anomalies are overstated, that each can be explained within the framework of gradual progress. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe was the product of exceptional hunter-gatherers. Perhaps Baalbek's stones were moved with ingenuity and patience. Perhaps Pumapunku's precision is overstated. These explanations are valid, and caution is necessary. But anomalies persist, and their collective weight raises questions that the framework struggles to answer. Why do so many sites appear fully formed? Why does knowledge vanish so easily? Why do myths echo real geological events? The deeper lesson may be that civilization is fragile and memory is imperfect. Knowledge can leap forward, collapse, and vanish, leaving only fragments. Myths and anomalies are those fragments, puzzles for us to piece together. They remind us that the story of humanity is larger than we can currently grasp, that what we call history may be only a chapter of a much longer book. To study anomalies is not to reject science, but to expand curiosity, to recognize that gaps and puzzles are part of the process. For if we ignore anomalies, we risk arrogance. We assume we know the whole story when in truth we have only fragments. We imagine ourselves the pinnacle of progress when we may be only the latest inheritors. The ruins, myths, and anomalies whisper otherwise. They tell us that others may have stood where we stand, gazed at the same stars, built monuments now in ruin, and then vanished. Their memory lingers not in textbooks, but in puzzles, waiting for us to listen. In this light, anomalies are not threats to knowledge, but invitations. They invite us to imagine, to question, to expand our story. They remind us that civilization is not fixed but fluid, that knowledge can be lost and found, that memory is fragile but enduring. They ask us to be humble, to recognize that the ground beneath our feet holds secrets older than we know. And they whisper that the story of humanity is far from complete, that what we call history is only a fragment, and that the rest still lies hidden, waiting to be remembered. To stand at the threshold of all these mysteries, ruins that seem too advanced, myths that echo across continents, symbols that repeat, languages that preserve fragments, anomalies that puzzle, is to recognize that the story of civilization is not closed. It is open, alive, and unfinished. The official timeline we inherit from textbooks is only one version, a skeleton pieced together from what survived. But what about the flesh that did not endure? What about the memories drowned beneath oceans, the languages silenced, the rituals forgotten? To imagine those absences is not fantasy, but humility, the recognition that history is a patchwork stitched from fragments, and that much has been lost. Civilization, in this sense, is not a straight climb, but a rhythm, rising, collapsing, remembering, forgetting, and rising again. We, too, are part of this rhythm. Our skyscrapers and satellites, our digital networks and archives feel permanent, but they are fragile in ways we rarely admit. Stone outlasts silicon. A pyramid endures for millennia, while a hard drive may not survive a generation. Should catastrophe strike, climate collapse, war, disease, or even simple neglect, how much of our world would remain? Future archaeologists might find fragments of concrete highways, twisted steel towers, or shards of plastic, puzzling over them as we puzzle over Baalbek or Puma Punku. Myths of our age might survive in distorted form, stories of flying machines, glowing screens, invisible webs of communication. We may be remembered not as inventors, but as gods of light who vanished, just as we remember the Maya or the builders of Göbekli Tepe. This realization should not only humble us, but also inspire us. If we are not the first to rise, then we are not alone in carrying the flame of civilization. Others carried it before us, and others may carry it after us. The question is not whether collapse will come, it always does, but whether memory will survive. That is the true task of civilization, to preserve memory across the abyss of time, to ensure that knowledge is not extinguished, but carried forward. Myths, rituals, symbols, languages, and monuments all serve this task. They are technologies of memory, designed not only to record, but to endure. Perhaps this is why the ancients obsessed over cycles. They knew collapse was inevitable, but they also knew renewal would come. The solstice is followed by light, the flood by fertility, the death by rebirth. To live within cycles is not to despair, but to trust that what is lost will return. Civilization itself may follow this cosmic pattern, rising and falling like the sun, carrying memory forward in fragments until it can bloom again. If so, then our role is not to escape the cycle, but to play our part within it, to preserve what we can, to honor what came before, to prepare the ground for what comes next. The great question that lingers is whether humanity's memory extends only backward into forgotten ages, or outward into the cosmos. Myths of star teachers suggest that we have always felt part of a larger story. Whether literal or symbolic, these myths remind us that we are not isolated. We are participants in a cosmic dialogue, part of a universe that is alive with meaning. Perhaps civilization is not only a human phenomenon, but a universal one, arising wherever memory takes root. If so, then our myths of gods from the sky may be fragments of a truth larger than Earth itself. But even if we never prove contact, the stars remain our teachers. They remind us of cycles beyond human time, of stability beyond human collapse. They anchor our myths, guide our rituals, and inspire our imagination. To align monuments with Orion or Venus is to declare that humanity belongs not only to Earth, but to the cosmos. To look at the sky is to remember, to participate in a story older than civilization. And so, after 20 parts, we return to where we began. The enigma of origins. Did civilization arise suddenly by chance? Was it gifted by gods, migrants, or even beings from beyond? Or was it the survival of fragments from forgotten ages, carried forward through myth, ritual, and stone? Perhaps it was all of these at once, layered together like the strata of the earth, each explanation true in its own way. What matters is not to choose one, but to recognize the depth of the mystery, to see civilization not as solved, but as a question still unfolding. The ruins whisper, the myths sing, the stars shine. They tell us that humanity is older, stranger, and more resilient than we know. They remind us that forgetting is as much a part of our story as remembering. They warn us that collapse is always near, but so is renewal. They invite us to imagine, to carry the flame forward, to honor the fragments we inherit and preserve them for those who come after. For in the end, civilization is not stone or metal or technology. It is memory, the fragile, enduring attempt to know who we are, where we came from, and where we are going. To listen to that memory is to hear echoes across millennia, voices of ancestors and perhaps of others, voices that speak through ruins and rituals, languages and stars. They do not give us clear answers, but they give us something better. The recognition that our story is larger than we think, and that we are part of a rhythm older than time itself. To live within that rhythm is to live with wonder, humility, and responsibility. For we too will one day be ruins and myths. The question is what fragments of memory we will leave, and whether those fragments will carry the flame of civilization into futures we cannot yet imagine.